Hey there and welcome back. I am so glad you're here tonight. You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about history as this grand sweep of battles and kings and revolutions. But what I find myself drawn to again and again are the quiet moments, the ordinary evenings, the times when history was not being made but simply being lived. And tonight I want to take you somewhere specific, somewhere you can almost feel the wooden floor beneath your feet and smell the smoke in the air. We are going to step inside a colonial home in the 1600s, right at that moment when the sun is starting to dip below the horizon, that threshold moment between day and night, between the world of work and the world of rest. And I have to tell you, what happened in those evening hours might surprise you. Because the way these people lived, the choices they made, the fears they carried, it is so far removed from anything we know, and yet there is something deeply human about it all, something that connects across the centuries. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you what it was really like when darkness began to fall on a 17th-century colonial evening. Picture this. It is late autumn, maybe November of 1665. You're walking down a dirt path in Massachusetts or perhaps Virginia. The exact location matters, but we'll get to that. Right now, what matters is the light. Because in the 1600s, time itself was measured differently than it is today. You did not check your watch. You did not glance at your phone. You looked at the sky. The sun is your clock, your calendar, your entire relationship with the passage of time. And right now that sun is getting low, real low. In winter months, by 5 or 5:30 in the evening, the light is already that deep, golden colour that tells you that you do not have much time left. Your shadows are stretching long across the frozen ground. And there is this urgency that builds in your chest, this very primal feeling that you need to get home. Not because you have dinner plans or a television show to catch, but because once that sun goes down, your world becomes a very different place. See, here is something we do not really think about in our electrically lit modern world. Darkness in the 1600s was not just inconvenient, it was genuinely dangerous. And I do not just mean physically, though we will get to the very real hazards of stumbling around in the pitch black. I mean psychologically, spiritually dangerous. The Puritans who made up a large portion of these early New England settlements truly believed that the devil and his demons were most active after dark, that evil spirits roamed freely once the sun went down. This was not folklore or superstition in the way we think of those things today. This was their reality, their understanding of how the world worked. William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote about the hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men. But it was not just the physical threats that worried him. It was the spiritual ones, the unseen ones. The Puritan minister Cotton Mather would later write extensively about witchcraft and demonic possession. And these were not fringe beliefs. These were mainstream accepted understandings of the world. So as you are hurrying home in that fading light, there is a very real sense of needing to get behind closed doors before full darkness arrives. And here is where the class differences in colonial society start to show up in interesting ways. If you were wealthy, and I mean truly wealthy, you might own a sundial. These were not common household items. They were markers of status. The kind of thing a successful merchant or plantation owner would have mounted near their front door. Brass or iron carefully calibrated to the latitude of your specific location. You could glance at it and know with reasonable accuracy what time it was. But if you were like the vast majority of colonists, you had no such luxury. You read time in the language of nature. The position of the sun, obviously, but also the behavior of animals, chickens going to roost, cows lowing to be milked. the way the light changed quality, shifting from bright afternoon sun to that syrupy golden hour to the purple blue of dusk. You developed an almost instinctive sense of time the way people who live closely with nature always do. And here is what is fascinating about this. In our world, time is this precisely measured thing. We are constantly aware of it, constantly checking it, constantly feeling like we do not have enough of it. But in the 1600s, time was fluid, seasonal, tied to natural rhythms. You worked while there was light. You rested when there was not. It sounds simpler, and in some ways it was, but it also meant that your entire life was governed by forces beyond your control in a way that is hard for us to fully grasp. So you are hurrying home now. Your feet know this path even as the light fades. Maybe you are a farmer returning from the fields. Maybe you are a craftsman closing up your shop in town. Maybe you are a woman returning from a neighbour's house where you've been helping with a birth or a sickness. The specific circumstances varied wildly, but the feeling was the same. That urgency, that need to be inside behind walls before the night truly arrived. And when your house comes into view, there is this moment of relief, because a house in the 1600s was not just shelter. It was survival. It was safety. It was the difference between life and death in very literal terms. The architecture varied depending on where you were and when exactly in the century we're talking about. Early settlements like Plymouth in the 1620s and 1630s had incredibly crude dwellings. We're talking about structures that were barely more than lean-tos, wattle and daub, which is basically woven sticks plastered with mud, thatched roofs made of dried grass or reeds, dirt floors. These were temporary structures meant to get people through those first brutal winters while they figured out how to survive in this new world. But by the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s, if you had survived and managed to make something of yourself, your house would be more substantial. In New England, we're talking about those classic colonial structures that are actually still standing today. Timber frame construction using massive hand-hewn beams, clapboard siding, a central chimney absolutely crucial for heating. Usually 2 rooms on the first floor, what they called the hall and the parlour, though the names are deceiving because they did not use these rooms the way those names suggest to us now. The hall was the main living space. It is where the cooking happened, where people gathered, where most of life took place. The parlour was more formal, often used for storage, for sleeping, for conducting business, if you had the kind of life that involved formal transactions. Upstairs, if there was an upstairs, you might have sleeping chambers, though often these were added later as families grew and prospered. In the South, in Virginia and the Carolinas, the architecture was a bit different, more spread out. You might have separate buildings for the kitchen to keep the heat out of the main house during those sweltering summers. If you were a plantation owner, which meant you were almost certainly using enslaved labour, your property would have been a complex of buildings. The main house, yes, but also cabins for the enslaved people who kept the entire operation running: workshops, barns, storage buildings. The geography of a plantation was a geography of power and exploitation literally built into the landscape. But tonight we're going to focus on something more middle of the road. A reasonably successful family in, let us say, Massachusetts Bay Colony, around 1665. Not wealthy, but not desperately poor either. The kind of family that made up the backbone of colonial society. The kind of family whose experience, while certainly not universal, gives us a window into what daily life was really like for a lot of people. So you are approaching your house now. It is a 2-story structure, maybe 30 feet by 20 feet. There is smoke coming from the chimney, which is a good sign. It means someone is home tending the fire. And that fire, as we're going to see, is absolutely the centre of everything that is about to happen this evening. You push open the door and immediately you're hit with a wall of sensations that would be overwhelming if you were not used to it. The smell of smoke, obviously. Wood smoke, yes, but also cooking smells. Maybe something savoury and meaty if you are lucky, but more likely the slightly sweet, slightly starchy smell of cornmeal. The smoke is not just in the air, it is everywhere. It has seeped into the timbers, into the cloth, into your clothes and your skin. Everyone in the colonial era smelled like smoke all the time. It was just part of existence. The temperature is shocking. Near the fireplace it is warm, even hot, but take a few steps away and it is cold. I mean genuinely cold. In November, even with a fire roaring, the far corners of the room might be hovering just above freezing. There is no insulation in the way we think of it. No weather stripping, no double-pane windows, just timber and plaster and a whole lot of gaps where the wind whistles through. And the light. Oh, the light. This is maybe the hardest thing for us to truly imagine. It is dim, so dim. Even with the fire going, even with maybe a candle or two, if you are prosperous enough, it is barely enough to see by. Shadows crowd everywhere. The corners of the room disappear into darkness. People's faces are lit from below by the fire, giving them this strange, almost otherworldly appearance. Your eyes are adjusting now. You've been outside where even in late afternoon there is still plenty of light. But in here your pupils dilate, trying to gather every photon they can find. It takes several minutes before you can really see clearly. And this transition from the outdoor world to the indoor world, from day to night, from light to dark, this is the threshold we are crossing. This is the moment where the evening truly begins. Your family is here. Your wife, let us say, is at the hearth doing something with the large iron pot that hangs over the fire. Your children may be 3 or 4 of them, if you have been fortunate, and they have all survived infancy, which was by no means guaranteed. The older ones might be doing some kind of work. The younger ones might be playing. The play in the colonial era looked different than it does now. Quieter, more subdued. Children were expected to be useful from a very young age. Everyone looks up when you enter. There is this moment of acknowledgement, a nod, maybe a word or two. But nobody rushes over to greet you with hugs and questions about your day. That is not how it worked. Physical affection was more restrained, not absent, mind you, but expressed differently, more formally. There was this sense that too much softness, too much indulgence was dangerous, bad for children's moral development. This was a culture that believed in discipline, in obedience, in preparing children for a hard world by not coddling them. But here is the thing. Underneath all that restraint, underneath the formal manners and the strict hierarchies, there was love. There was care. We know this from the letters people wrote, from the diaries they kept, from the small gestures recorded in historical documents. A father bringing home a whistle for his son after a trip to town. A mother sitting up all night with a sick child. These people felt deeply. They just expressed it within the rigid framework of their culture. You take off your outer layers, a heavy coat if you have one, though many people could not afford such luxuries, your boots caked with mud. You might warm your hands by the fire, feeling the blood start to flow back into fingers that have gone numb from the cold. And there is this settling sensation, this exhale. You have made it home, you're inside. You're safe, at least for tonight. But the evening is just beginning. There is so much still to do before sleep can come. Meals to prepare, animals to tend, children to supervise, prayers to say, work to finish. The night is not a time of leisure, not really. It is just a different kind of work, a different kind of survival. And as you stand there by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, casting their warm orange light on the faces of your family, you are part of something larger than yourself. You are part of a great experiment, this colonial project. You are building something, whether you fully realize it or not. A new society, a new way of life, and it is happening one evening at a time, one meal at a time, one small domestic moment at a time. The fire crackles, someone stirs the pot, a child coughs, outside the darkness deepens, and life goes on. Now as the door closes behind you and your eyes continue adjusting to the firelight, we need to talk about that fire. Because nothing, and I mean nothing, was more important to colonial survival than the fireplace. It was not just a convenience or a comfort. It was life itself. And the way people thought about fire, used fire, feared fire, it tells us so much about what it meant to be alive in the 1600s. So let us move closer to those flames and really understand what we are looking at here. There is something almost hypnotic about a fire, is there not? Even today, with our central heating and our thermostats, we still gather around fireplaces when we have them. We still stare into the flames. There is something primal there, something that reaches back through thousands of years of human evolution. But in the 1600s, that fireplace was not just a pleasant amenity. It was not something you enjoyed on a cold winter evening while sipping hot chocolate. It was the absolute center of existence. And I mean that literally. Everything, and I do mean everything, revolved around that fire. Let me paint you a picture of what we are actually looking at here. The fireplace in a typical colonial home was massive by our standards. We are talking about an opening that might be 5, 6, even 7 feet wide. Deep enough that you could walk into it, which people actually did sometimes when working with the fire. The hearth itself, the floor of the fireplace, would be made of stone or brick if you could afford it, flat-laid fieldstone if you could not. And rising up through the center of your house was this enormous chimney built of brick or stone, taking up a huge amount of interior space but absolutely necessary for survival. Now here is where the architecture gets interesting, and where we see real regional differences based on climate. In New England, where winters were brutal, that chimney was almost always placed right in the center of the house. Think about the physics of this for a moment. A massive column of brick or stone heated by the fire, radiating warmth in all directions. It was essentially a thermal battery, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. The layout of the house would be organized around this central chimney, with rooms clustered around it to maximize the benefit of that radiant heat. But in Virginia, in the Carolinas, in the warmer southern colonies, you would often see chimneys placed on the exterior walls, sometimes 2 chimneys, one on each end of the house. Why? Because in the summer you did not want all that heat mass sitting in the middle of your home. You wanted it outside where it could vent heat away rather than trap it inside. The architectural choices people made were directly tied to survival, to comfort, to making life bearable in their specific climate. And let me tell you something that might surprise you. We have this romantic image of colonial homes as these cozy, warm spaces, right? Everyone gathered by the fire, all snug and comfortable. But the reality was so much harsher than that. Yes, if you were standing right by the fire within about 6 feet of those flames, you might actually get quite warm, hot even, uncomfortably hot on the side facing the fire. But turn around and your back would be cold. Take a few steps away from the hearth and the temperature would drop dramatically. There are accounts from the period of ink freezing in inkwells that were sitting on tables just 15 feet from a roaring fire, of water in cups forming ice on the surface. In the winter months, the far corners of these rooms might hover barely above freezing, even with the fire going full blast. People would describe their faces burning from the heat, while their backs remained frozen. It was this bizarre, uncomfortable middle ground between too hot and too cold, and there was no real way to escape it. And think about what this meant for daily life. Where you positioned yourself in the room was not a casual choice. It was a calculated decision based on temperature tolerance on what you were doing on your status in the family. The best spots near the fire were not just comfortable, they were prestigious. The father of the household would typically have a chair positioned in the prime location. Children might be relegated to the cooler periphery. This might sound harsh, but remember, this was a society built on strict hierarchies. Everything had an order, a place, a proper arrangement. The fireplace itself was built into the wall with incredible thickness. We're talking about walls that might be 3-4 feet thick at the base of the chimney. This was partly for fire safety, obviously. The last thing you wanted was for the heat to ignite the wooden structure of your house. But it also created these wonderful deep recesses on either side of the fireplace. In a well-appointed home, these recesses might have built-in seats, letting you literally sit inside the fireplace area, surrounded by warmth on 3 sides. In simpler homes, these spaces might be used for storage, keeping things near the fire where they would not freeze. Now let us talk about the fire itself, because maintaining a fire in the 1600s was serious business. This was not like flipping a switch or adjusting a thermostat. This was skilled labour that required constant attention. In most households, this fell primarily to the women, though everyone had to know how to manage a fire because letting it go out could be genuinely dangerous. Here is something that most people do not realise. Many families tried to never let their fire go completely out. Not ever. The reasoning was practical. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel was difficult, time-consuming work. It could take 10, 15, 20 minutes of frustrating effort, especially if your tinder was damp or if conditions were not ideal. So the strategy was to bank the fire at night, covering the coals with ash to preserve them, and then coax them back to life in the morning. A fire might be kept going continuously for months, even years. But of course, fires did go out. A draught might scatter the banked coals. The wood might not have been dry enough. Someone might have made a mistake in the bedtime fire management, and when that happened, you had a few options, none of them great. You could go through the laborious process of starting a fire from scratch. Or, and this was more common, you could send someone to a neighbour's house to fetch fire. Literally carrying hot coals in a covered pan, rushing back home before they died out, using those borrowed coals to restart your own fire. There was no shame in this. It was just part of community life, this sharing of literal fire from hearth to hearth. The wood itself tells us a lot about colonial life. Oak was prized for its long, steady burn, hickory for its intense heat. Pine would burn fast and hot, but did not last. Different woods were chosen for different purposes, for different times of year, for different types of cooking, and the amount of wood required was staggering. A single household might burn through 30, 40, even 50 cords of wood in a winter. If you do not know what a cord is, it is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Imagine filling your living room floor to ceiling with stacked firewood, and then imagine doing that 40 times over. That is how much wood we're talking about, which meant that somebody had to cut all that wood. Usually the men and older boys of the household spending countless hours with axes and saws, felling trees, cutting them into manageable lengths, splitting them, stacking them to dry. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Axes slipped, trees fell the wrong way, backs were strained, hands were blistered. But it had to be done because without that wood you would freeze. It was that simple. Now the danger of fire itself was ever present in these communities. We have building codes now, fire department sprinkler systems. They had none of that. And these houses, remember, were essentially wooden boxes filled with wooden furniture, cloth straw, and constantly burning flames. Fire safety was a community concern, which is why many towns passed laws about chimney construction about keeping chimneys clean, about how to manage fires. In New Amsterdam, which would later become New York City, the Dutch authorities banned thatched roofs in 1657 because they were such a fire hazard. This was a big deal because thatched roofs were cheap and relatively easy to make. Forcing everyone to switch to wooden shingles or tiles was expensive, but the risk of fire was considered too great, especially in a town where houses were built close together. And despite all precautions, fires happened. Devastating fires. There are records of entire sections of towns burning down because one chimney caught fire, or because someone knocked over a candle, or because a spark jumped from a fireplace onto a wooden floor. The response was communal. Every household was supposed to keep leather fire buckets by the door. When a fire broke out, everyone would rush to form bucket brigades passing water from wells or ponds, trying desperately to contain the blaze before it spread. Often they failed, but beyond the practical dangers, beyond the constant labour of maintaining the fire, there was something almost sacred about the hearth. This was the heart of the home in every sense. This was where food was cooked, where people gathered, where families came together. In a very real way, the fire was the family. There are expressions from this period that have come down to us. Hearth and home. Keeping the home fires burning. These were not just poetic phrases, they were literal descriptions of what held a family together. The smoke, which we mentioned earlier, deserves its own consideration because it was absolutely everywhere. Colonial homes did not have the kind of efficient chimneys we have today. They were better than nothing, certainly, but a lot of smoke would escape into the room, especially when the wind was blowing in certain directions, especially when the fire was first starting up or dying down. Over time, this smoke would coat everything. The beams overhead would turn black. Cloth would take on a yellowish-brown tinge. People's lungs would be affected. Respiratory illnesses were common, and the constant smoke exposure certainly contributed to that. Yet there was a benefit to all that smoke, strange as it sounds. It helped preserve meat. In many colonial homes you would see hams or sides of bacon hanging from the rafters near the chimney, slowly being cured by the smoke. It was an efficient use of an unavoidable byproduct. Nothing was wasted. Everything served multiple purposes. And then there were the accidents. Oh, the accidents. Cooking over an open fire with long skirts and loose sleeves meant that women's clothing caught fire with horrifying regularity. There are probate records and court documents full of cases where women died or were severely injured from their clothes igniting. Children, curious and unsteady, would fall into the fire or pull pots of boiling liquid down on themselves. Men would be burned while tending the fire or while working with hot metal or coals. Burns were treated to the extent they could be treated with homemade remedies, lard or butter smeared on the wound, poultices made from herbs, prayer, always prayer. But infection was common and severe burns were often fatal. The fireplace gave life, but it also took life. It was this dangerous, necessary, beloved and feared presence in the centre of the home. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to live your entire life within a 10-foot radius of open flames, to cook every meal, heat every room, light every evening, warm every bath, all with fire that you had to constantly monitor, constantly feed, constantly respect? It would change you, I think. It would make you hyper-aware of danger. It would teach you caution and respect in a visceral way that our modern conveniences simply cannot. But it would also give you something we have lost. A relationship with fire, with light, with warmth as these precious, hard-won resources. Nothing was taken for granted. Nothing was automatic. Every comfort was earned through labour and attention and skill. And there is something profound in that something that our abundant, convenient modern life has traded away. As the evening deepens in our colonial home, as the family settles into the rhythm of the night, that fire continues to burn. It crackles and pops. Sometimes a log will shift, sending up a shower of sparks. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a play of light and dark that is endlessly mesmerizing. And in the warmth of that fire, in its light, the evening's activities can truly begin. But here is the thing about that light. Firelight alone was not really enough to work by. Not for detailed tasks. Not for the kind of work that still needed to be done before sleep could come. And so colonial families had to solve this problem of darkness. In other ways, some of them quite clever, some of them expensive, all of them absolutely necessary. So let us talk about what happened when you needed to see, after the sun went down, about the precious and precarious business of making light. Imagine for a moment that every single light in your house suddenly goes out. Your phone dies, your laptop shuts down, every screen, every bulb, every glowing digital clock face goes dark, and outside there are no streetlights, no car headlights, no neighbour's porch light bleeding through the curtains. Just darkness, complete absolute darkness. How long could you function? How long before the disorientation sets in, before you start feeling genuinely anxious? Now imagine that is just your normal Tuesday evening. Because for colonial families, once the sun went down, that level of darkness was simply reality, and the solutions they came up with to push back against that darkness tell us so much about their lives, their economy, their priorities, their entire worldview. The fireplace gave some light, certainly, but firelight is flickering, unreliable, and confined to the immediate area around the hearth. If you wanted to move around the house, if you needed to do any kind of detailed work, if you wanted to read or write or sew, you needed another source of illumination. You needed candles, or rushlights, or if you were wealthy enough, oil lamps. And each of these options came with its own set of challenges, its own costs, its own place in the social hierarchy. Let us start with the most common source of light for ordinary families, tallow candles. Now, when I say tallow, what I am talking about is rendered animal fat. Usually beef fat, though mutton fat worked too. And making these candles was a process that was, to put it mildly, not pleasant. It was smelly, labour-intensive, and had to be done in large batches because candles did not last very long. The process went like this. You would save up all your animal fat trimmings over time, storing them until you had enough to make candle making worthwhile. Then you would render the fat, which means heating it slowly to melt it and separate out any bits of meat or tissue. The smell of rendering fat is something that is hard to describe if you have never experienced it, but imagine the greasiest, heaviest, most cloying smell you can think of, and then imagine that smell permeating your entire house, your clothes, your hair for days. That was candle making. Once the fat was rendered and clarified, you had a few options for actually forming the candles. The most common method for home production was dipping. You would take a wick, usually made from twisted cotton or linen fibres, and dip it repeatedly into the melted tallow. Each dip would add a thin layer of fat. You would let it cool and harden between dips. Dip cool, dozens and dozens of times until you built up enough layers to make a proper candle. It was tedious work, often done in the fall when the weather was cool enough that the tallow would harden between dips, but not so cold that you could not work comfortably. If you were more prosperous, you might have candle moulds. These were usually made of tin or pewter, shaped like tubes open at both ends. You would thread a wick through the centre, pour in melted tallow and let it cool. Much faster than dipping, but moulds were expensive and not everyone could afford them. Now here is the thing about tallow candles. They worked, but they were not great. They smoked. They smelled this sort of greasy animal smell that would intensify as they burned. They dripped constantly because tallow has a relatively low melting point, so you needed to be careful about where you placed them. And they did not burn very brightly. A single tallow candle produces maybe 1/10 the light of a modern 60-watt bulb. 1/10. Think about that. You would need 10 candles to equal the light from a single modest light bulb. But here is where things get really interesting from an economic perspective. Candles were expensive. Not in terms of the raw materials necessarily, though those had value, but in terms of the time and labour required to make them, and in terms of their scarcity. A typical tallow candle might burn for 3 to 4 hours before it was consumed, and making enough candles to last a family through a winter could take weeks of dedicated labour, so candles were rationed carefully. Families would not just light a candle every evening for fun, they would calculate, do we actually need this light right now? Can we make do with firelight? Can we finish this task earlier in the day when we have natural light? The phrase, burning the candle at both ends, which we use now to mean overworking yourself, comes directly from this period. Because if you literally lit both ends of a candle to get more light, you were using it up twice as fast. It was wasteful, foolish, unsustainable. There was a better option if you could afford it: beeswax candles. These were luxury items, genuinely expensive, and they were everything that tallow candles were not. They burned cleaner with almost no smoke. They smelled pleasant, slightly sweet from the natural honey scent of the wax. They did not drip as much because beeswax has a higher melting point, and they burned brighter and longer than tallow. But beeswax was scarce and costly. You needed bees, obviously, and not everyone kept bees. Even if you did, the amount of wax you could harvest was limited. A strong hive might produce a few pounds of wax per year, and it took quite a bit of wax to make even a single candle. So beeswax candles were reserved for special occasions, church services, important guests, events where you wanted to make an impression. The average colonial family might use beeswax candles a handful of times per year, if that. And then there was the ultimate luxury in candle technology: spermaceti candles. Now, spermaceti is this waxy substance found in the head cavity of sperm whales. When processed and refined, it makes absolutely superb candles. They burn bright, clean and slow. They do not drip. They barely smoke. In terms of candle technology, they were essentially perfect. But they were also phenomenally expensive. We are talking about candles that might cost 10, 20, even 30 times what a tallow candle cost. Only the wealthy could afford them. Having spermaceti candles in your home was a status symbol, a way of demonstrating that you had money to literally burn. And I find it fascinating that the whaling industry, which would become so important to New England's economy in the 18th and 19th centuries, was driven in part by this demand for luxury lighting. Think about the chain of events here. Men would go out on dangerous months-long voyages into the North Atlantic and beyond, hunting these massive creatures, processing them at sea under horrific conditions, all so that wealthy people in Boston or Philadelphia or Charleston could have brighter candles in their parlours. The global economy of the 1600s and 1700s was already connecting distant places and people in ways that are almost hard to comprehend. Now, for poorer families who could not afford to make or buy enough candles, there was another option: rush lights. These were a traditional form of lighting brought over from England, and they were about as cheap and simple as lighting technology gets. Here is how they worked. You would gather rushes, which are these long pithy plants that grow in wetlands. You would peel away most of the outer green skin, leaving just one thin strip to hold the pith together. Then you would dry them. Once dry, you would dip them repeatedly in rendered fat, just like making a candle, except the rush itself served as both wick and fuel. The result was something that burned for maybe 20 or 30 minutes, producing a small flickering flame. Not much light, not much duration. but incredibly cheap to make if you had access to rushes and some saved-up fat. Many poor families relied on rushlights as their primary source of evening illumination. You would keep a little holder, usually a simple metal clip on a stand, and you would work your way through a dozen or more rushlights in an evening. The phrase, "not worth a rush," meaning something is worthless, comes directly from this technology, because a single rushlight was about the cheapest, most disposable thing you could imagine. Yet for the people who depended on them, those rushlights were precious. They meant the difference between working in darkness and having just enough light to finish mending a shirt or preparing food for the next day. And then there were pine knots, which we touched on briefly before. These chunks of resinous pine wood would burn bright and hot, giving off a decent amount of light. They were free if you lived near pine forests, which most New England colonists did. You would gather them, split them into manageable pieces and burn them in a holder or directly in the fireplace. But pine knots had significant drawbacks. They produced a lot of smoke. They dripped this sticky, flaming resin that could cause burns or start fires if you were not careful. And the historian William Wood, writing in 1642, said they droppeth a pitchy kind of substance where it stands, and were really only suitable as a shift among poor folks. Even people who used them regularly acknowledged that they were not ideal. But when you are cold and in the dark and you cannot afford better, ideal is not the standard. Adequate is enough. All of these lighting technologies shared one common feature. They were dim. So dim by our standards. Even the best spermaceti candle produces a fraction of the light we consider normal. And this had profound effects on how people lived. Reading was difficult and could strain your eyes. Detailed work like sewing or writing had to be done very close to the light source. Many tasks that required good visibility simply could not be done after dark, no matter how much light you had. This is why bedtime came so much earlier in the colonial period than it does for us. It was not just that people were tired from physical labour, though they certainly were. It was that once the sun went down, there was only so much you could do, so you might as well go to bed, conserve your candles, and get up with the sun when you could see again. The entire rhythm of life was dictated by the availability of light, and there was a moral dimension to all of this too. The Puritan mindset which dominated much of New England was deeply suspicious of idleness. The devil, they believed, found work for idle hands. So the evening hours had to be used productively. Even in dim light, even by the dying fire, there were prayers to say catechisms to recite work to finish. Leisure in the sense that we understand it barely existed. Everything was oriented toward productivity, toward improvement, toward spiritual and material advancement. But within those constraints, people found moments of pleasure. A mother might tell stories to her children while spinning by firelight. A father might carve a small toy while the family sat together. Young people might find excuses to sit closer together, sharing the light of a single candle while pretending to focus on their work. Human nature finds a way even in the most restrictive circumstances. I think what strikes me most about colonial lighting is how it forces us to confront our own relationship with light and darkness. We live in a world that is never truly dark. Even at night, even in our bedrooms, there are little LED indicators on our devices, street lights filtering through windows, the glow of a charging phone. We have banished darkness almost entirely from our lives, and with it, I think we've lost something. That awareness of darkness as a real force, as something to be respected and managed and occasionally just accepted. Colonial families knew darkness intimately. They lived with it every evening, and the light they created, whether from a sputtering tallow candle or a carefully hoarded beeswax one, was precious, because it was hard-won and temporary. Every flame was a small victory against the night. Every hour of light was borrowed time that would have to be paid back when the candle burned down and the darkness returned. As the evening progresses in our colonial home, as the family works by whatever light they have managed to create, the time is approaching for the evening meal. And this meal, this gathering around food prepared over that ever-present fire, is going to reveal even more about how these people lived, how they thought about nourishment and family and their place in the world. So let us turn our attention now to the meal itself, to what is cooking in that great iron pot, and to the complex choreography of feeding a family in the 1600s. The smell reaches you before you even see the food. Something savoury, earthy, with that indefinable quality that comes from hours of slow cooking over wood flames. Your stomach responds immediately, reminding you that you've been working since before dawn, and that your last substantial meal was many hours ago. The evening meal in a colonial home was not the elaborate affair we might imagine, but it was essential both for the calories it provided and for what it represented in the daily rhythm of family life. That great iron pot hanging over the fire, the one we mentioned earlier, has been simmering most of the afternoon. These pots were among the most valuable possessions a family could own. Some of them weighed 40 pounds or more when empty. They were expensive, often passed down through generations, and they were virtually indestructible. You could use the same pot every single day for decades, and it would just get better with age, building up layers of seasoning that kept food from sticking and added flavour to everything cooked in it. What is in that pot tonight? Well, that depends on so many factors. The season, the region, the prosperity of the family, whether there has been a recent harvest or hunt. But for an ordinary family in Massachusetts in November, we can make some educated guesses based on historical records and probate inventories and those wonderful detailed account books that some colonists kept. Most likely you're looking at some variation of a one-pot meal. Everything cooked together in that big iron pot because that was efficient, it conserved fuel, and honestly it was the only practical way to cook for a family when you only had one pot and one fire. In New England, this often meant a dish they called pottage. Now, pottage is essentially a thick stew, but that word does not really capture what we're talking about here. This was the foundation of the colonial diet eaten day after day, with variations based on what was available. The base would typically be water, or if you were fortunate, some kind of broth made from bones saved from a previous meal. Into that would go whatever grains you had. In the early colonial period, that almost always meant corn. Indian corn maize, the crop that Native Americans had been cultivating for thousands of years, and which the colonists learned to grow out of sheer necessity. Corn was not what English people were used to eating. They wanted wheat, which made proper English bread. But wheat was difficult to grow in New England, especially in those early decades. The soil was different, the climate was harsher, and they simply had not figured out the agricultural techniques yet. So corn became the staple. Ground into meal, it could be made into a kind of porridge that the colonists called samp. Or it could be baked into cornbread, though, that was usually eaten at other meals. For this evening pottage, you might have whole kernels of corn or cracked corn or cornmeal all simmering together with whatever else was available. And what else might be available? Beans. Almost certainly beans. The combination of corn and beans, which Native Americans had been growing together for centuries in the same fields, provided a nearly complete protein. The colonists did not understand the nutritional science, but they knew from observation and from native teaching that this combination kept you strong and healthy. The dish called succotash, which is still eaten today, comes directly from this tradition. The Narragansett word msikquatash meant boiled corn kernels, and the English adapted it. If there was meat, it would be in the pot too, though meat was not an everyday thing for most families. Maybe some salt pork, a few precious ounces of preserved pork added for flavour as much as substance. Salt was expensive, but it was the primary way to preserve meat before the days of refrigeration. Every fall, families who could afford it would buy or raise a pig, slaughter it, and salt the meat to last through the winter. That salt pork would be rationed carefully, a little bit added to meals to make them more substantial and satisfying. Or perhaps there was a bit of dried fish. Cod was abundant off the New England coast, and it could be salted and dried and stored for months. It was not glamorous eating. Dried cod had to be soaked to remove the salt, and even then it was tough and strong tasting. But it was protein, and protein kept you alive and working. Into the pot might also go vegetables if there were any still available in November. Root vegetables mostly, turnips, parsnips, carrots. Though these were not as common or as sweet as the carrots we know today, onions, definitely onions, which stored well and added tremendous flavour to the bland pottage. Maybe some dried pumpkin or squash reconstituted in the cooking liquid. The colonists learned from native peoples to grow pumpkins and squash, and these gourds stored remarkably well in cool, dry places. What you would not find in this pot or anywhere in a colonial home in the 1600s were potatoes. I know that seems strange because we associate potatoes so strongly with historical European and American diets. But potatoes did not become common in the English colonies until well into the 1700s. They were viewed with suspicion, believed to cause disease, thought to be food fit only for animals. That prejudice took a long time to overcome. Similarly, tomatoes were not eaten. They were considered poisonous, which is almost funny given how central tomatoes are to so much of what we think of as traditional cooking now. The colonists could have been eating tomato sauce and marinara and salsa, but instead they avoided tomatoes entirely. So our pottage is simmering away this thick, hearty mixture of corn and beans, and maybe a bit of meat, and some root vegetables all flavoured with salt, and perhaps a few dried herbs if the household had any. Sage thyme, maybe some savoury. These herbs were grown in kitchen gardens during the summer and dried for winter use. They were medicinal as well as culinary use to treat various ailments, and every housewife would have known their properties and uses. But here is where things get really interesting, and where we need to talk about the skill required to cook this meal. Remember, you are cooking over an open fire. There is no temperature dial, no timer, no ability to simply turn down the heat if something is cooking too fast. The cook almost always, a woman had to manage the fire itself, adjusting the logs, moving the pot higher or lower on its trammel, which is the adjustable hook system that held the pot over the flames. Too hot, and the bottom of the pottage would scorch, ruining the entire meal and wasting precious food. Too cool, and it would not cook properly, and there was not enough time or fuel to waste on inefficient cooking. The cook had to judge by sight, by smell, by the sound of the bubbling, by long experience. She had to know her fire, know her pot, know her ingredients. This was skilled labour, absolutely. And it was dangerous labour too. Think about the mechanics of what is happening here. You're wearing a long wool dress, possibly with an apron over it. Your sleeves are long. You're leaning over an open fire, reaching to stir a pot that weighs 50 pounds when full of food and boiling liquid. The heat is intense. The smoke is in your eyes. One slip, one moment of inattention, and you could pull that pot down on yourself or fall into the fire or catch your clothes on a flame. And this happened regularly. Probate records from the period are full of cases of women dying from burns sustained while cooking. Court records mention children being scalded by boiling pots. This was one of the leading causes of injury and death for women in the colonial period. Every time a woman cooked a meal, she was taking a genuine risk, and she had to do it anyway every single day because her family needed to eat. The tools available to help with this dangerous work were fairly basic. Besides the great pot, there would be a long iron spoon for stirring, maybe a flesh fork, a two-pronged fork for lifting meat out the pot, iron tongs for moving logs in the fire, a skimmer, a flat perforated spoon for removing foam or fat from the top of the pot, These tools were simple, heavy and purely functional, nothing decorative, nothing wasted on aesthetics. Form followed function absolutely. Some wealthier households might also have a roasting spit, a long iron rod that could be suspended over the fire with meat threaded onto it. This required someone, usually a child, to slowly turn the spit to cook the meat evenly. Hours of mind-numbing work standing in the heat and smoke, turning. In England, wealthy households sometimes used turnspit dogs, small dogs bred specifically to run inside a wheel that turned the spit. But in the colonies, that job fell to children. Now the timing of supper was interesting. Remember, dinner was the main meal of the day, and it was eaten at midday. We talked earlier about how meal names worked, but it bears repeating because it is so different from how we eat now. Dinner was the big meal eaten when there was natural light to see by, and when you needed calories to get through the afternoon work. Supper was lighter, eaten in the evening, often consisting of leftovers from dinner or bread and cheese or this pottage we've been describing. The word supper itself comes from the practice of supping, of sipping or eating soup-like foods. It was not meant to be an elaborate meal. It was sustenance before bed, fuel for the night. And in practical terms, it made sense. You did not want to go to sleep on a full, heavy stomach when you would be sleeping in a cold room under insufficient blankets. A lighter meal was more comfortable. But even this simple meal required preparation, and that preparation had often been going on all day. The beans, if there were beans, would have been put to soak the night before. The corn might have been ground that morning, a laborious task involving a hand-cranked mill or even a mortar and pestle. The vegetables would have been brought up from the root cellar, brushed clean of dirt, chopped. The fire would have been built up to the right heat. The pot would have been cleaned from the previous meal, a task that involved scrubbing with sand or ashes, since they did not have soap in the way we know it. Every meal, even the simplest meal, represented hours of labour spread across multiple people. Nothing was convenient. Nothing was instant. And I think that is something we have almost completely lost touch with in our modern world. We can heat up dinner in minutes or order food delivered to our door. We have no visceral understanding of the sheer amount of work that went into feeding a family before modern conveniences. The pottage is ready now. The woman of the house, standing carefully back from the fire, uses a ladle to fill wooden bowls or pewter bowls if the family is prosperous enough to own such things. The earliest colonists often ate from trenchers, which were not really dishes at all, but rather thick slabs of day-old bread that served as edible plates. By the 1660s, most families would have at least a few proper bowls, though they might still use trenchers for some meals. There are no individual servings in the sense we know them. The pottage is distributed, but everyone is not getting their own individual portion calculated for their nutritional needs. The father gets the most because he is the head of the household, and his labour is considered the most valuable. Adult sons get substantial servings. The mother serves herself last, and often less, because that is the expectation. Children get smaller amounts, and they might not even get their own bowls. They might share or eat from a common dish, or simply have their portions doled out into their hands or onto a piece of bread. And here is something that might surprise you. The children are probably not even sitting down yet. We're going to talk about that in much more detail in just a moment, about the whole elaborate social structure of the colonial family meal. But for now, just know that respect, deference, and hierarchy governed everything, even the simple act of eating supper. The steam rises from the bowls. The smell fills the room, mingling with the smoke and the scent of burning wood. Hands reach for spoons, one of the few utensils that was common. No forks, remember. Those would not become standard in American households for another 100 years or more. You ate with a spoon for liquids and with your hands for everything else. There was no shame in this. It was simply how things were done. and as the family prepares to eat as bowls are passed and the first cautious tastes are taken, because the pottage is still very hot, there is a moment of pause, a moment of gathering. Because this meal is not just about nutrition, it is about something much larger. It is about family structure, about social order, about the values and beliefs that hold this entire society together. So let us watch closely as this family sits down to eat and see what their evening meal reveals about who they were and what they believed. If you were to walk into this room right now as a modern person with modern sensibilities, one of the first things that would strike you as genuinely strange would be the children. Not that they are there, but where they are and what they are doing. Because the children in this colonial household are not sitting at the table. At least not most of them. They are standing behind their parents or off to the side waiting. And this is not some special occasion or punishment. This is just how meals worked. Let me take you back to something the historian Alice Morse Earle wrote about in her book, Child Life in Colonial Days, published in 1899 but based on extensive research into 17th and 18th century sources. She describes how in many colonial households, children could not be seated at the table even after grace had been said. They stood through the entire meal. Sometimes they had a standing place with a plate or trencher. Sometimes they stood behind the adults and took whatever food was handed to them. In some homes, children sat or stood at a side table and had to run over to the main table when they needed more food. Think about that for a moment. You're maybe 7 years old. You've been working all day because children worked from the time they were old enough to be useful. You are hungry, really hungry, and dinner, or in this case supper, is right there in front of you. You can smell it. You can see the steam rising from the bowls, but you cannot sit down. You have to stand there watching your parents eat, waiting for your turn, maintaining perfect silence and obedience. Why? What was the reasoning behind this? Well, it comes down to the fundamental structure of colonial family life, which was intensely, almost rigidly hierarchical. The family was not a democracy. It was not even really a partnership in the modern sense. It was a hierarchy modelled after the political and religious hierarchies that governed the larger society. God was at the top, then the king, then the local authorities, then the father of the household, then his wife, then the children, in order of age and gender, then any servants or apprentices, and at the very bottom any enslaved people, if the family held people in bondage. This hierarchy was not just theoretical. It was enacted and reinforced in every aspect of daily life, and meal times were one of the primary ways it was demonstrated. The father sat at the head of the table in the best chair if the family owned more than one. He was served first and he got the best portions. This was not considered selfish or unfair. It was the natural order of things. His labour, his decision-making, his role as spiritual leader of the family, all of this gave him priority. The mother would be seated as well, though in a less prominent position. She'd already done the work of cooking, and now she was managing the meal, making sure everyone was served, keeping an eye on the children ready to jump up if anything was needed. Her role was active even while sitting. She was not relaxing. She was orchestrating. Older children, particularly sons who were approaching adulthood, might be allowed to sit at the table, especially if they were old enough to be doing adult work. But younger children stood, and this was considered good for them character building. It taught them patience, obedience, respect for authority. These were not just nice ideas. These were the foundational values of the society. Alice Morse Earle describes the formality that existed at more fashionable tables. Children might be given a few drops of wine heavily diluted with water, in which to drink the health of their parents. The formula in one family was health to papa and mama, health to brothers and sisters, Health to all my friends. In another family, only the father's health was named. These were rituals, little ceremonies that reinforced who mattered most, who had authority, who deserved honour and deference. And here is something that I find both fascinating and slightly heartbreaking. Children were often not allowed to speak during meals unless spoken to. They ate in silence, or as near to silence as children can manage. The conversation at the table was between adults. Children were present, they were observers, but they were not participants. They were learning through repetition and example how to behave, how to defer, how to wait their turn. Does this sound harsh? By our standards, it absolutely does. We encourage children to express themselves, to share their thoughts, to be active participants in family life from a young age. But the colonial mindset was completely different. Children were seen as naturally sinful, prone to wickedness, in need of strict discipline to mould them into proper Christian adults. The Puritan view which dominated much of New England was that children's wills needed to be broken early, that too much indulgence would lead to moral corruption. And yet here is the complicated part. This does not mean that parents did not love their children. The historical record is full of evidence that they did. Letters between parents and children are warm, affectionate. Diaries record genuine grief when children died, which happened with terrible frequency. There are mentions of small gifts, of special treats, of tender moments. One father writes about bringing home a whistle for his son from town. Another describes sitting up all night with a sick child. So how do we square these two things? The strictness, the formality, the standing through meals, and yet also genuine love and affection. I think the answer is that they believed, truly, believed that this strictness was the most loving thing they could do. That by teaching discipline, obedience, and respect for authority, they were preparing their children for survival in a harsh world and for salvation in the next life. Their expressions of love just look different from ours. The meal itself was eaten with what we would consider very basic manners, but what for the time was perfectly acceptable. You used a spoon for the pottage. You ate with your hands for anything solid. You did not wipe your hands on your clothes, you used a napkin if you had one, or you simply licked your fingers clean. You did not reach across the table. You asked for things to be passed to you, or you waited for them to be offered. You did not leave the table without permission, and you absolutely did not waste food. Wasting food was not just impolite, it was almost sinful. Food was too precious, too hard won. The trenchers or bowls were often shared. Two people might eat from the same trencher, taking turns or dividing it between them. This was especially common for children or for less important members of the household. The idea of everyone having their own individual plate was a luxury, not a standard. And honestly, with the amount of dishwashing that would be required, sharing made practical sense. Water had to be hauled from a well or stream heated over the fire used sparingly. Every dish that needed washing was more labour. There were no forks, as we've mentioned. Forks were used in Italy at this time, and they were starting to appear in wealthy English households, but they were considered a feat unnecessary, even vaguely immoral. Real men ate with their hands and their knife. The knife, by the way, was a personal item. You brought your own knife to the table. Men carried knives as part of their daily equipment, used for everything from cutting food to cutting rope to self-defense. It was a tool, not just a dining implement. And speaking of tools, let me tell you something interesting about spoons. Spoons were valuable. A set of pewter spoons might be mentioned specifically in someone's will, passed down as an inheritance. Wooden spoons were more common for everyday use, carved by hand, smoothed with use, until they were almost silky. You could read a family's prosperity in their spoons. Pewter meant you had money. Silver meant you were wealthy indeed. Wood meant you were ordinary, which most people were. The pottage is eaten slowly, carefully. It is hot and there is no reason to rush. The family is together sharing this moment of sustenance and communion. But the hierarchy is maintained throughout. The father might comment on the meal and the mother would respond. Children would not interject unless invited to. If a child needed more food, they would wait for a pause in the adult conversation, then politely request it or wait for it to be offered. And what about quantity? How much did people eat at this evening meal? Probably less than you might think, especially compared to our modern portions. Remember, this was a light supper, not the main meal. The father might have 2 bowls of pottage, the mother perhaps 1.5. Children might share a bowl between 2 of them, or get a smaller individual serving. The goal was to be satisfied but not stuffed, to have enough energy to finish the evening's work, to stay warm through the night, but not to waste precious food. There might also be bread if the household had bread. Cornbread was common, though it was nothing like the sweet cakey cornbread we know today. Colonial cornbread was dense, crumbly, made with just cornmeal, water and salt. It was filling and it was practical, but it was not particularly delicious. If you had wheat flour, you might make a better bread, but wheat flour was expensive and often had to be imported. Most families ate corn products day after day after day, until they were thoroughly sick of it. To drink, there would not be water, interestingly enough. Water was often unsafe to drink, contaminated by animals or human waste, or simply standing too long in wooden barrels. Adults would drink beer or cider, which the alcohol content made safer. Children would drink heavily diluted beer, or cider sometimes called small beer, which had very little alcohol but was still safer than water. The idea of drinking pure water with a meal was actually quite foreign. Water was what you drank if you had nothing else, and you took your chances. As the meal winds down, as bowls are emptied and set aside, there is a moment of collective satisfaction. Bellies are full, or at least fuller. The work of eating is done. But there is still more work to come before sleep, still more rituals to be observed. Because this family does not simply finish eating and disperse to their own activities. That is not how it works. They are a unit bound together by blood and necessity and belief, and their evening together is far from over. But before we move on to what happens next, I want you to hold this image in your mind for a moment. This family gathered around their rough table in the dim firelight, eating their simple meal. The father at the head, the mother managing, the children standing or sitting in their assigned places. Everyone knowing their role, everyone acting within the bounds of what is expected. It is so foreign to us, and yet it worked. Millions of families organized themselves this way, day after day, generation after generation. And from this structure, from this rigid hierarchy, came the people who would eventually build a nation that claimed to value equality and democracy. The contradictions are profound, are they not? But that is history, full of contradictions, full of people who are products of their time, believing things that seem strange or wrong to us, and yet also human, also struggling, also trying to build good lives for themselves and their families within the constraints they knew. The meal is finished. Bowls are being collected. Children are dismissed to their next tasks. And now, as the evening settles deeper and the fire continues to burn, the family's attention turns to the work that must still be done before sleep can come. Because in the colonial world, an evening at home was not a time of rest. It was just a different kind of labour undertaken in dimmer light and with colder hands, but labour nonetheless. So let us see what these hours between supper and sleep really looked like for people who measured their lives by the amount of work they could accomplish. Watch closely now as the family moves into the rhythm of evening labour. The bowls have been cleared away, stacked near the fire where they will be dealt with later. and immediately, without pause or discussion, everyone transitions into their next set of tasks. There is no moment of collective relaxation, no sitting back to let dinner settle. The concept of leisure time, of unstructured free time, barely exists in this world. There is work to be done, and the dim hours between supper and sleep are when much of that work happens. The mother moves to a spinning wheel if she has one, or more likely to a drop spindle, which is the more common tool for turning raw wool or flax into thread. Spinning is not optional work. It is not a hobby or a craft in the way we might think of those things today. It is essential labour that directly determines whether her family will have clothes to wear. Let me walk you through what this actually involves, because I think we have lost all sense of how much work went into something as basic as having a shirt. First, you need fibre, either wool from sheep or flax from plants. If you have sheep, and many colonial families did, then every spring there was shearing. The wool would come off the animal greasy, dirty, full of bits of vegetation and dung. It had to be washed, dried, and then carded. Carding is the process of brushing the wool between two flat paddles studded with wire teeth, pulling the fibres parallel and removing tangles. It is repetitive, somewhat tedious work, but absolutely necessary. Once the wool is carded, it can be spun. And here is where it gets interesting. Spinning is a skilled task that requires coordination, rhythm, and years of practice. With a drop spindle, you're essentially twisting fibres together while letting the weight of the spindle provide tension and momentum. Your hands have to work independently, one feeding fibre, one controlling the twist. It is meditative once you get good at it, but for beginners it is frustrating, producing uneven, lumpy thread. A good spinner, and the mother in our household would have been spinning since she was a girl, could produce maybe 4 or 5 skeins of yarn in an evening. That sounds like a lot until you realize how much yarn is needed to make even a simple piece of clothing. A shirt might require 20 or 30 skeins. A blanket might require 100 or more. So every evening, sitting by the fire, spinning. The wheel or spindle turning the thread, growing slowly inch by inch. And we actually have records of this. There is a wonderful diary kept by a young woman named Mary Sumner in the late 18th century, though the habits she describes reach back into the 17th century. She writes entries like, "I stuck pretty close to my work today, and did all that Sister gave me, and after I was done I swept out the house and put things to rights." And another entry, "I improved my time before breakfast. After breakfast made some biscuits and did all my work before the sun was down." The phrase, "improved my time," shows up again and again in these diaries. That was the language they used. Not wasting time or killing time, but improving it, making it productive, using it well. The Protestant work ethic, the Puritan suspicion of idleness, it was not just preached from pulpits. It was lived in these evening hours. While the mother spins, an older daughter might be sewing, mending more likely. Because in a world where cloth is expensive and time-consuming to produce, you do not throw away clothes when they develop holes or tears. You mend them, you patch them, you darn the socks and reinforce the elbows and let down the hems as children grow. Sewing by candlelight or firelight is difficult. The light is dim and flickering. Your eyes strain. But the work has to be done, and daylight hours are needed for outdoor work that cannot be done after dark. The needles they used were precious items. Steel needles had to be imported from England, and they were expensive. A packet of needles might be mentioned in a letter, the way we might mention a significant gift. Women kept their needles carefully, often stuck into a scrap of cloth or wool to prevent rust. Losing a needle was a genuine crisis. Without it you could not sew, which meant you could not maintain the family's clothing, which meant the family's ability to survive was compromised. And what is the father doing during all this? Well, that depends on the season and his occupation. In November, with the harvest finished and the fields prepared for winter, he might be working on tool maintenance, sharpening axes and saws, repairing harnesses, making or fixing wooden implements. Much of farm equipment in this period was made of wood, and it wore out regularly. Handles broke, joints loosened, things needed constant attention. Or he might be doing woodworking of a different sort, making furniture, simple furniture that the family needs, a bench, a storage chest. Colonial furniture was mostly utilitarian, built for function rather than beauty. It was made from local woods, usually pine or oak, joined together with wooden pegs and basic joinery. A skilled craftsman could make something quite lovely, but for most farmers the goal was simply to make something that worked. In the dim light he works by feel as much as by sight. His hands know these tools, know this wood. There is a rhythm to the work, the scrape of plane on wood, the rasp of saw through timber. It is physical labour, but of a different kind than field work, more precise, more focused, and there is satisfaction in it, in taking raw material and shaping it into something useful. The children have their own work too, and it's not play work or pretend work. It is real labour that contributes to the household. Younger children might be carding wool, as we mentioned, or they might be winding yarn into skeins, or shelling dried beans for storage, or peeling rushes to be dipped in fat for rushlights, or any of a dozen other small but necessary tasks. Older boys might be helping their father, learning skills by watching and practicing. The apprenticeship model was how most people learned trades in this period. You did not go to school to learn carpentry or blacksmithing or coopering. You watched your father or a master craftsman, and you tried and you failed and you tried again until you got it right. Education was practical, hands-on, and it happened in these evening hours as much as during the day. Older girls would be with their mother, learning the vast array of skills that women needed to manage a household. Spinning, yes, but also preserving food, making medicine from herbs, managing the kitchen garden, caring for sick family members, assisting with births. The historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich wrote a book called A Midwife's Tale, based on the diary of Martha Ballard, a midwife and healer in late 18th century Maine. The range of knowledge and skills Martha possessed was staggering. She could deliver babies, treat illnesses, prepare bodies for burial, make textiles, garden, brew beer, and manage a household economy. And she learned all of this through apprenticeship, through watching other women and practicing under their guidance. But here is something that might surprise you. Despite all this work, despite the constant labour, there are moments of connection, of teaching, of intimacy. The mother, while spinning, might tell stories, family stories, Bible stories, cautionary tales. The father, while working with wood, might teach his son not just the technical skill but the values behind it, the importance of good workmanship, of finishing what you start, of taking pride in your labour. These lessons were not always gentle. Mistakes were corrected sharply. Laziness was not tolerated. But there was also patience, the kind that comes from understanding that learning takes time. A father showing his son how to sharpen an axe properly, guiding his hands, adjusting his angle. A mother correcting her daughter's spinning technique, demonstrating the rhythm, the tension. These were moments of transmission, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. And they talked. Despite the work, or perhaps because they all had their hands occupied, conversation happened. News from other families in the community, discussions about upcoming tasks, memories of previous years. The conversation was not free-flowing in the way we might expect. There were topics that were appropriate and topics that were not. Children were expected to listen more than speak. But the family was together, sharing space and time and purpose. What strikes me about all of this is the complete integration of work and life. We tend to separate these things. Work happens at work. Home is for relaxation. But in the colonial period, home was work. There was no division. Your house was your workshop, your factory, your store, your school. Everything happened in the same space, often in the same room around that same fire that we keep coming back to. And because everyone's labour was visible, there was a shared understanding of how hard everyone was working. The father saw his wife spinning every evening and knew the hours that went into making a single shirt. The children saw their father repairing tools and understood that maintaining a farm required constant attention. Everyone's contribution was acknowledged because everyone's labour was on display. There is something powerful in that, I think. In our modern world, so much labour is invisible. We do not see the work that goes into the products we buy or the services we use. We are disconnected from the processes that sustain us. But in a colonial household, nothing was hidden. You knew exactly where your food came from, who made your clothes, what it took to keep you warm and fed and clothed. Does that mean life was better then? No, of course not. It was harder in almost every measurable way. But it was more honest, perhaps, more direct. You could not take anything for granted because you were intimately familiar with how much work went into everything. The evening wears on. The candle burns lower if there is a candle. The fire needs to be fed again, and someone, usually a child, brings more wood from the stack kept near the hearth. The temperature has dropped as night deepens. Even close to the fire you can feel the chill creeping in. But the work continues. Hands keep moving. Spindles keep turning. Saws keep cutting. Because stopping means falling behind, and falling behind means not having what you need when you need it. There is no clock to watch, no definite end point to the evening's work. You work until the task is done, or until the light fails completely, or until exhaustion makes continued labour impossible or dangerous. And then only then does the family begin to transition toward the final activities of the evening, the rituals that must be observed before sleep can come. Because this is a devoutly religious household, and no day ends without acknowledging the God they believe governs every aspect of their lives. So as the tools are set aside, as the spinning wheel stops its turning, as hands are wiped clean, and children are called to attention, the family gathers once more. Not for food this time, but for something they consider even more essential. For the spiritual sustenance that they believe protects them through the night and prepares them for the day to come. Let us join them as they settle into the most sacred part of their evening routine. The room grows quieter now. The clatter of work fades. Tools are set down with a kind of reverence, as if the transition from labour to prayer requires a physical marking, a deliberate change in posture and purpose. The father reaches for the family Bible, and everyone in the room shifts their attention. This moment, what happens next, is not optional. It is not something done when the mood strikes, or when there is extra time. It is as necessary as breathing, perhaps more necessary because these people genuinely believe that their eternal souls depend on it. Religion in the colonial 17th century was not what religion is for many people today. It was not a private matter, a personal choice, something you did on Sundays and then set aside the rest of the week. It permeated everything, every decision, every relationship, every understanding of how the world worked was filtered through a religious lens. And nowhere was this more evident than in these evening devotions, this daily ritual of Bible reading and prayer that bound the family together in spiritual community. The father is the spiritual head of the household. This is not just tradition, it is theology. In the Puritan understanding of social order which dominated much of New England and influenced even non-Puritan colonists, the family was little church, a little commonwealth. Just as a minister led a congregation and a magistrate led a town, the father led his family in spiritual matters. It was his responsibility, his duty given by God to ensure that everyone under his roof was instructed in Scripture and protected from sin. The Bible he holds is probably the only book in the house. Books were expensive, precious objects. A Bible might cost the equivalent of a week's wages or more. It would have been purchased, if purchased at all, as one of the most important investments a family could make. More likely it was inherited, passed down from parents or grandparents, its pages worn from years of nightly readings, its margins perhaps marked with notes or important dates, births, marriages, deaths. The family Bible was not just a religious text, it was a record, a chronicle of the family's existence. The Geneva Bible was popular in this period, especially among Puritans. It was a bit more compact and affordable than the larger pulpit Bibles, and it included marginal notes that helped readers interpret difficult passages. Later in the century, the King James Version would become more common, but in the 1660s many households still used Geneva Bibles brought over from England or passed down through families. The father opens the Bible. His finger finds the place perhaps marked with a ribbon or a scrap of paper. The light is dim, remember. Reading requires bringing the book close to the candle, or the fire, squinting at the small print. Many men in this period could read at least somewhat. New England in particular had high literacy rates because the Puritans believed everyone needed to be able to read Scripture for themselves. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had even passed a law in 1642 requiring that children be taught to read, and in 1647 they passed the old Deluder-Satan Act requiring towns of a certain size to establish schools. The name of that law tells you everything you need to know about the motivation. They called Satan the old deluder, who wanted to keep people ignorant of Scripture. Education was a weapon against the devil. Literacy was a form of spiritual warfare. Can you imagine thinking about reading that way, not as a practical skill or a path to economic advancement, though it was those things too, but as a way to protect your soul from eternal damnation? So the father reads. His voice fills the room, slow and deliberate. He might read from the Psalms, which were especially popular for evening devotions, or from the Gospels, or from the letters of Paul. The choice of passage might relate to something happening in the family or community. An illness might prompt reading about healing or about Job's patience in suffering. A good harvest might lead to psalms of thanksgiving. The Bible was not just read as abstract truth. It was applied to daily life, used as a guide for navigating the complexities and dangers of existence. Everyone is expected to listen attentively. Children are especially watched because children's minds wander, and wandering minds during scripture reading is a sign of spiritual danger. The mother listens while perhaps still doing some small task with her hands, some work that does not require much attention. The older children listen with varying degrees of focus. The younger children try their best, though the language is difficult, the concepts often beyond their understanding. After the reading comes the catechism. Now, if you're not familiar with catechisms, they are essentially question and answer formats for teaching religious doctrine. The most common in New England was the Westminster Shorter Catechism, approved by the Westminster Assembly in England in 1647. It consisted of 107 questions and answers about Christian belief, and children were expected to memorize it, all of it. The father might ask a question. What is the chief end of man? And a child standing straight would answer from memory. Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Or, what is sin? Sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. These answers were drilled into children from a very young age. By 5 or 6 years old, a child was expected to know at least the early portions of the catechism. By adolescence, they should know the entire thing. We have records of this practice in multiple sources. Mary Sumner, whose diary we mentioned earlier, writes on July 8th about going and said my catechism today, came home and wrote down the questions and answers, then dressed and went to the dance, endeavoured to behave myself decent. The catechism was homework, a requirement checked and verified regularly. Church ministers would quiz children on their catechism knowledge. Parents would test them at home. It was serious business. And think about what this meant psychologically. From your earliest memories, you are being taught that you are sinful, that your natural inclinations are wicked, that without God's grace you are destined for hell. The language of the Catechism does not soften these concepts for children. It presents them starkly clearly. You are a sinner. You deserve punishment. Only through Christ can you be saved, and even then salvation is not guaranteed. You must constantly examine yourself, constantly fight against your sinful nature. For modern ears, this sounds harsh, even cruel. We do not generally tell children that they are fundamentally wicked and deserving of eternal torture. But the Puritan mindset and the broader Protestant mindset of this period believed this was the truth, and they believed that not teaching children this truth would be the real cruelty, because it would leave them unprepared for judgment. Yet here is what is complicated. Within this framework of sin and judgment, there was also tremendous emphasis on God's mercy, on the possibility of redemption, on the love of Christ. The Catechism questions about sin are balanced by questions about grace, about salvation, about the promise of eternal life for believers. Children were taught to fear God, yes, but also to trust in His promises, to find comfort in Scripture, to believe that living a godly life would lead to both earthly stability and heavenly reward. After catechism comes prayer, family prayer led by the father, with everyone kneeling if there is space, or at least bowing their heads in reverence. These prayers were often quite long. They would include thanksgiving for the day's blessings, however meagre those blessings might seem, requests for protection through the night, confession of sins committed during the day, prayers for neighbours, for the community, for the church, for the government, for the king across the ocean, prayers for the sick, for travellers, for anything and anyone that needed divine intervention, and they believed, truly believed, that these prayers mattered, that God heard them and responded to them, that prayer was effective, powerful, a real force in the world. When someone recovered from illness, it was because God had answered prayers. When someone died despite prayers, it was because God had other plans, mysterious but ultimately good. Everything that happened was interpreted through this lens of divine providence. The fear of night that we talked about earlier was not just superstition, it was theologically grounded. The Puritans believed that Satan and his demons were real active beings who sought to corrupt and destroy souls. Nighttime, when visibility was low and vulnerability was high, was when evil forces were most active. So these evening prayers were not just routine, they were spiritual protection, a shield against the darkness in both literal and metaphorical senses. There are accounts from the period of people experiencing what they believed were demonic attacks at night. Strange noises, feelings of oppression or fear, sleep paralysis, which we now understand as a neurological phenomenon, was interpreted as demonic visitation. The theological explanation for these experiences was that Satan was testing their faith, trying to find weak points, looking for opportunities to lead them into sin. And the defense was prayer, scripture, godly living. This might all sound very grim, and in many ways it was. The constant focus on sin and judgment, the vigilance required to maintain spiritual purity, the fear of damnation. It was a heavy burden, especially for children. But it also provided structure, meaning purpose. These people believed they were part of a cosmic drama, that their daily choices mattered not just for this life but for eternity. Their struggles had significance, their suffering had purpose. They were not just surviving day to day, they were fighting for their souls. And there was comfort in that, strange as it might sound. When life was hard, and it was hard constantly, there was consolation in believing that God saw your struggles, that your faithfulness would be rewarded, that all the suffering of this world was temporary compared to the eternal joy that awaited believers in heaven. The evening prayers reinforced this worldview, reminded the family of what they were working toward, what they were enduring for. As the prayer concludes, as everyone murmurs, "Amen," there is a moment of collective stillness. The spiritual work of the day is done. The family has acknowledged their dependence on God, recommitted themselves to godly living, asked for protection and blessing. Now the focus can shift to the final practical preparations for sleep. But before anyone moves toward their beds, before the night truly settles in, there is often a brief space for something a bit lighter. Not frivolous, never frivolous, but human. A few moments of conversation perhaps, a brief story, a question answered. These people were not robots, not automatons marching through religious exercises. They were human beings who needed connection, who found joy in small things, who cherished moments of warmth and fellowship, even within the strict boundaries of their faith. And it is in these small moments, these brief interludes between prayer and sleep, that we sometimes see the most authentic glimpses of colonial family life. When the guard comes down just slightly, when the formality relaxes just a fraction, and we see people simply being together, finding what comfort they can in each other's presence, creating small islands of pleasure in a sea of labour and duty. So as the family begins to shift from this sacred time toward the more mundane business of preparing for bed, let us watch how these final moments of the evening unfold. Because even in something as simple as ending the day going to sleep, there are rituals and patterns that reveal so much about how these people thought, what they valued, what they feared, and what they hoped for as they closed their eyes and surrendered to the darkness. Something shifts in the atmosphere once the prayers are finished. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The tension eases just slightly. Shoulders relax. There might even be a small smile or two. Because here is a truth that might surprise you about these supposedly austere, joyless Puritans and colonists. They knew how to find pleasure. They understood the need for human connection and small delights. They just had to find these things within the very narrow boundaries that their culture and beliefs allowed. Now, we're not talking about wild entertainment here. There are no television screens flickering in the corner, no board games spread across the table, no children running around with toys. But there are other things, quieter things, more intimate things. And if we look closely, we can see moments of genuine joy and warmth in these final hours before sleep. Music, for instance. Music was complicated in Puritan culture. Some forms of music were considered dangerous, too worldly, too connected to sin and frivolity. Dancing was often viewed with suspicion, or outright banned, depending on the community and the time period. But other forms of music were not just acceptable, they were encouraged. Psalm singing, obviously. Hymns. And in some households, especially those with more progressive leanings or connections to the Anglican tradition, rather than the strict Puritan one-instrumental music was welcomed. A father might play the fiddle if he owned one and knew how. These were not fancy instruments. They were homemade or cheaply purchased, functional rather than beautiful. But in the hands of someone with even modest skill, a fiddle could produce something lovely. Simple tunes, folk melodies brought over from England, perhaps adapted to new words about new experiences in the New World. Or perhaps there was a flute. We actually have a wonderful account from the diary of Anna Green Winslow, a young woman living in Boston in the 1770s, though, describing customs that reached back into earlier decades. She writes about an evening gathering. In the evening, young Mr. Waters, hearing of my assembly, put his flute in his pocket and played several minuets and other tunes to which we danced mighty cleverly. Danced mighty cleverly. What a delightful phrase. And notice the context. This is not a public dance which might have been scandalous depending on the community. This is a private gathering in a home with family and perhaps a few neighbours. The music is provided by someone they know playing for the pleasure of it, and the young people dance. Not wildly, not immodestly, but cleverly, which in the language of the time meant skillfully, appropriately well. Even in more restrictive households there might be singing. Family singing gathered around the fire. Perhaps a psalm sung in unison, the words familiar from church but given new warmth by being sung together at home. Or perhaps a ballad, a story song about love or adventure or tragedy. The English and Scottish traditions were full of these, and colonists brought them across the ocean, adapted them, created new verses about their new experiences. There is something powerful about voices raised together in song. It creates a sense of unity, of shared purpose and shared emotion. And I think in those moments, singing by firelight the hardness of daily life might have felt a bit more bearable. The isolation of being in a small settlement surrounded by wilderness might have felt a bit less lonely. The sound of their own voices harmonizing, however imperfectly, was a reminder that they were not alone, that they were part of something larger than themselves. Storytelling was another form of evening entertainment, though again the stories had to be appropriate. Bible stories were always safe. The adventures of David, the patience of Job, the wisdom of Solomon. But there were also family stories, histories passed down from grandparents and great-grandparents. Stories about the old country, about England, about the journey across the ocean, about the early days of the settlement, when everything was harder and more dangerous than it was now. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, certainly, but they also educated, transmitting knowledge about the family's history, about proper behaviour, about the values that the family held dear. A grandfather might tell about his own childhood in England, emphasising how hard he worked, how respectful he was to his elders, how these virtues led to his success. The implicit message, follow my example, leave as I lived, and you too will prosper. Or a mother might tell a cautionary tale about a girl who disobeyed her parents and came to ruin. Or about a boy who was lazy and suffered for it. These were not just stories. They were moral instruction packaged in narrative form to make them more memorable, more impactful. And then there were the riddles. Oh, colonists loved riddles. Riddles and word games and little puzzles that tested wit and knowledge. These were considered wholesome entertainment because they exercised the mind, and mental exercise was seen as valuable and godly. A father might pose a riddle to his children, and they would compete to solve it first. The riddles were often religious in nature, based on scripture or on moral lessons, but some were simply clever wordplay linguistic puzzles that required thinking in new ways. For example, a riddle from the period, what is it that God never sees, that the king seldom sees, that we see every day, and that is more worth than all the gold in the world? The answer, an equal. God sees no equal because nothing is equal to God. Kings seldom see equals because they are above most people, but ordinary people see their equals every day, and equality, or at least the idea of it, was beginning to be valued in new ways in colonial America, even if the reality of life was still deeply hierarchical. Games were also part of evening entertainment, though again within strict boundaries. Children might play simple games that did not involve gambling or excessive competition. Cat's Cradle, where you make intricate string patterns with your fingers, was popular. It required skill and patience, and it could be done by firelight without needing much space. Or jacks, though they called it jackstones back then. You would use small stones or seeds instead of metal jacks and a smooth pebble or small ball. The game is essentially the same as the modern version. Toss the ball, pick up stones, catch the ball before it bounces twice. It developed hand-eye coordination and quick reflexes, which were valuable skills in a world where so much work required manual dexterity. Some games were specifically designed to teach useful skills. There were counting games that helped children learn numbers, guessing games that developed memory, physical games that built strength and agility. Play was not just for fun, it was preparation for the adult work that children would soon be doing. In wealthier households, particularly among the merchant class or plantation owners, the evening might include actual leisure activities that we would recognize. Reading for pleasure if there were books beyond the Bible. Some families owned copies of Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, published in 1678, which became enormously popular in the colonies. It was religious, certainly a Christian allegory about the journey from sin to salvation. But it was also a good story with adventure and drama and memorable characters. Or there might be letter writing. Correspondence with family members in other colonies or back in England was precious a way of maintaining connections across vast distances. Letters would be written slowly, carefully, because paper was expensive, and the opportunity to send a letter might not come often. Months might pass between sending a letter and receiving a response. But those letters were treasured, read and reread, shared with neighbours, kept as records of family history. And in some households there was conversation. Real conversation, not just the exchange of necessary information or the giving of instructions. Discussions about philosophy, about theology, about current events in the colony or in England. The colonial period was a time of tremendous intellectual ferment. Ideas were changing, old certainties were being questioned, and some families, particularly educated families, engaged with these ideas in their evening conversations. But we should be clear, these moments of pleasure, these small entertainments, they were brief. They were limited. They happened, if they happened at all, in the small gaps between labour and sleep. Most evenings were dominated by work and by religious observance, the spinning, the sewing, the tool repair, the catechism, the prayers. These were the constants, the music, the stories, the games. These were the exceptions, the small graces that made the hardness bearable. And even in these moments of pleasure there was always an undercurrent of awareness that such things should not be taken too far. That too much enjoyment was dangerous. That the line between innocent pleasure and sinful indulgence was thin and easily crossed. The phrase, "idle hands are the devil's workshop," was not just a saying. It was a genuine belief. Leisure had to be justified, had to serve some higher purpose, or it risked becoming idleness, and idleness was a sin. This tension between the human need for joy and the religious suspicion of pleasure is, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of colonial culture. These people were not miserable. They were not joyless automatons, but their joy had to be carefully managed, carefully contained, always subordinated to higher purposes. Work, godliness, survival. These were the priorities, everything else was secondary, yet human nature finds a way. In the warm tone of a father's voice when he answers his son's question, in the smile that passes between mother and daughter as they work side by side, in the moment when the whole family laughs together at a shared joke or a funny story. These tiny moments of connection, of warmth, of love, they happened. They must have happened. Because otherwise how could people have endured? How could they have kept going day after day through such hardship and restriction and constant labour? The fire is burning lower now. Someone needs to tend it, to add more wood, or to bank it for the night. The candles, if there were candles, are burning down to stubs. The darkness outside is complete. Inside, the family is together, has been together all evening, working and praying and perhaps playing just a little. And now the time has come for the final transition of the day, the shift from waking to sleeping, from activity to rest. But sleep in a colonial household was not the simple private affair it is for most of us today. It was communal, complicated, and governed by its own set of rules and rituals. The way these people slept, where they slept, what they thought about sleep and dreams, and the vulnerability of unconsciousness, it reveals yet another layer of their lives, another way in which their experience was profoundly different from ours. So as the family begins to prepare for bed, as children are gathered and final tasks are completed, let us follow them through this last ritual of the evening and see what bedtime really looked like in a 17th-century colonial home. Bedtime in our modern world is often a solitary affair. We retreat to our private bedrooms, close our doors, maybe scroll through our phones for a few minutes, and then drift off into our individual cocoons of sleep. Privacy is assumed. Personal space is expected. But step into this colonial home as the family prepares for bed, and you will find something entirely different. Something that might make you uncomfortable if you're used to having your own space. Because in the 17th century, sleep was communal, crowded, and completely devoid of what we would consider privacy. First, let us talk about the beds themselves, or rather what passed for beds. The wealthiest families might own an actual bedstead, a wooden frame raised off the floor with ropes or leather straps stretched across it to support a mattress. These bedsteads were valuable pieces of furniture often mentioned specifically in wills and inventories. They represented a significant investment and a marker of prosperity. But the mattress on top of that bedstead was nothing like the comfortable, supportive mattresses we sleep on today. It was called a bed tick, and it was essentially a large cloth bag, usually made from coarse linen or even burlap stuffed with whatever filling material was available. For most families that meant straw, plain ordinary straw from wheat or rye or whatever grain they grew. The straw would be replaced periodically as it broke down and became dusty, but between replacements you were sleeping on increasingly lumpy, increasingly uncomfortable material. If you were fortunate, if your family had done well and could afford a small luxury, you might have chaff instead of straw. Chaff is the outer husks of grain, and it is softer than whole straw, less pokey, more comfortable. It still compressed over time and needed replacing, but it was an upgrade. And if you were truly wealthy, if you were among the elite of colonial society, you might have feathers. A feather tick stuffed with goose down or duck down was incredibly expensive and incredibly desirable. It was warm, soft, relatively comfortable by the standards of the time. But we're talking about maybe 1% of the population who could afford such a thing. For everyone else, you made do with straw or chaff, and counted yourself lucky if your bed was off the ground and relatively free of vermin. Speaking of which, let us address something that is unpleasant but important. Beds in the colonial period were full of bugs. Bedbugs, fleas, lice, all manner of small creatures that fed on human blood and made sleep itchy and uncomfortable. There was no real way to prevent this. You could shake out your straw regularly, you could air your bedding in the sun when weather permitted, you could try various herbal remedies that were supposed to repel insects. But fundamentally, you were sharing your bed with bugs, and everyone just accepted this as normal. The phrase, "sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite," comes directly from this period. The sleep tight part refers to the ropes or straps that supported the mattress. Over time, they would stretch and sag, making the bed uncomfortable. So you would have to tighten them, literally tightening the ropes to create a firmer sleeping surface. Sleep tight on your tightened ropes, and even so you would be sharing your bed with bedbugs. It was just reality. Now, who slept where? This is where things get really interesting from a modern perspective. Remember, most colonial homes had only 2 rooms downstairs, the hall and the parlour. If there was an upstairs, and in many homes there was not, it might be divided into 1 or 2 sleeping chambers. So you had very limited space, and you had an entire family that needed to sleep somewhere. The parents would typically have a bed in the parlour, or in an upstairs chamber if one existed. This was their space, though. Even this was not entirely private. Infants and very young children would sleep with their mother literally in the same bed. This was partly for warmth, partly so the mother could nurse during the night, and partly for safety. Infant mortality was high, and keeping the baby close was seen as a way to protect them. Older children would share beds, not just rooms beds. 2, 3, sometimes 4 children sleeping in the same bed crosswise if necessary to fit everyone in. And this was not seen as hardship or deprivation. It was just how things were done. Beds were expensive. Heating was limited. Sharing body warmth made practical sense. Privacy was not valued the way we value it today. The concept of everyone having their own sleeping space would have seemed wasteful, even bizarre. Some families used trundle beds for children. These were low beds on wheels that could be rolled under a larger bed during the day and pulled out at night. It saved space and meant that a small room could accommodate more sleepers. Children would literally sleep under their parents' bed, in some cases pulled out on their trundle, tucked away again in the morning. And here is something that might surprise you. In many households, particularly in winter, people did not sleep in what we would consider bedrooms at all. They slept in the main living area near the fire, because remember, that fire was the only source of heat, and letting it go out completely meant waking up to a freezing house. So the family might cluster around the hearth on beds or mattresses or pallets on the floor, trying to stay within the range of the fire's warmth. This meant there was essentially no privacy for anyone. Parents could not have private conversations or intimate moments without being overheard. Children saw and heard everything. The entire rhythm of the night, the snoring and coughing and tossing and turning, was a shared experience. And this had implications for how people thought about individuality, about personal space, about the boundaries between self and family. The bedding itself was minimal by our standards. A sheet, if you had one, made from homespun linen. Blankets, usually wool, heavy and scratchy but warm. These blankets were valuable, often listed in estate inventories, sometimes given as gifts or inheritance. A good woolen blanket could last for years if properly cared for. And then there were quilts. Quilting was a practical art, taking scraps of fabric that were too small for other uses and piecing them together to create a large warm covering. The quilts that have survived from this period show remarkable skill and creativity, but they also show pragmatism. These were not decorative items. They were functional objects designed to keep people warm through cold nights. In winter, the cold was genuinely dangerous. Even sleeping near the fire, you might wake up to find frost on the inside of the windows, ice in the water bucket, your breath visible in the air. Some families used warming pans, which were metal pans with long handles that you would fill with hot coals from the fire, then run between the sheets to warm the bed before getting in. It was a temporary warmth, fading quickly, but it made the initial shock of getting into a cold bed slightly more bearable. Or you might use hot bricks or stones heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth tucked at the foot of the bed to warm your feet. This worked better in some ways because the stones would retain heat longer than coals, but you had to be careful not to burn yourself, and you had to make sure the cloth wrapping was thick enough that it did not catch fire. Getting ready for bed was a process. You did not just climb in wearing whatever you had on during the day. People typically slept in their undergarments, which for men was a long shirt called a shift, and for women a similar long shift or smock. These were made of linen worn next to the skin during the day, under outer clothing, and then slept in at night. You would remove your outer layers, hang them up, or fold them carefully, because clothing was too valuable to treat carelessly and retire in your shift. In winter, you might keep on more layers, additional shirts, wool stockings, even a cap to keep your head warm. The idea of sleeping partially dressed might seem uncomfortable to us, but when the alternative is waking up half frozen, you made accommodations. Before getting into bed, there were final small tasks. Checking that the fire was properly banked for the night, covered with ashes to preserve the coals without allowing flames that might spread. Making sure the door was barred, because while crime was not as common as in larger European cities, it was not unknown, and wild animals were a real concern in frontier areas. Some families would leave a small light burning overnight, a single candle, or a rushlight, partly for practical reasons if someone needed to get up in the night, and partly for psychological comfort. The fear of complete darkness was real. The association of darkness with danger, both physical and spiritual, meant that having even a tiny flame was reassuring. And then finally, people would lie down, parents in their bed, children in theirs, or on pallets on the floor or on trundle beds pulled out from under the main bed. In the larger beds, you did not spread out the way we do today. You stayed close together, partly for warmth, partly because the beds were not that large, and partly because that is just what you were used to. Personal space, as we understand it, did not exist. Think about what this means for child development, for personality formation. You never had a moment alone, truly alone from birth, until you left home as an adult. You were always surrounded by family, always observed, always part of the collective unit. There was no place to retreat when you wanted solitude, no room of your own where you could close the door and be private. How does that shape you as a person? How does it affect your sense of self, your relationship with others, your need for independence or connection? Some historians argue that the modern concept of the individual, of the autonomous self that we take for granted, did not really exist in this period, at least not the way it does now. You were defined by your relationships, by your place in the family and community, not by your individual desires or preferences, and the physical reality of never being alone reinforced this psychologically. Sleep itself was different too. Without artificial light extending the day, without the stimulation of screens and entertainment, people went to bed earlier and slept longer, often 9 or 10 hours in winter. But the sleep was not continuous in the way we think of it today. There are records from this period of what historians call first sleep and second sleep. People would go to bed shortly after dark sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night. During this waking period, they might tend the fire, use the chamber pot, have quiet conversations, pray, or even get up and do some light work. Then they would return to bed for a second sleep that would last until dawn. This pattern seems strange to us, but it was normal for them, and in a way it makes sense. In a cold house with a fire that needs tending, waking up in the middle of the night to check things, to add wood to make sure the family is warm and safe, that is practical. The modern expectation of 8 hours of continuous sleep is actually the anomaly, not their pattern of divided rest. Dreams were taken seriously. They were seen as potentially meaningful, possibly messages from God, or warnings or prophetic visions. But they could also be temptations from the devil trying to lead you astray. People would discuss their dreams, try to interpret them, pray about disturbing dreams. The line between waking reality and sleeping visions was more permeable than it is for us. The supernatural was always close, always pressing in, and so the family settles into sleep. The room grows quieter, though never silent. Someone snores. A child whimpers and is soothed. The fire crackles softly as the logs shift. Outside, the night sounds continue. Wind in the trees, Possibly the howl of a wolf in the distance, though by the 1660s most wolves had been driven away from established settlements. The rustle of some small animal moving through dry leaves. This moment, this transition into sleep is the most vulnerable time. Eyes are closed, awareness fades, the body is at rest, and in that vulnerability there is an act of faith, a surrender to forces beyond your control. You trust that the fire will not spread, that the house will not be attacked, that you will wake up in the morning. Nothing is guaranteed. But you do it anyway, night after night, because there is no alternative. Sleep is not optional, it is survival. And as we stand here in this darkened room, watching this family slide into sleep, listening to their breathing deepen and slow, we are witnessing something profoundly human. The universal need for rest, for the temporary oblivion that allows the body and mind to recover from the day's labours. They sleep differently than we do in different circumstances with different fears and beliefs. But the fundamental act of sleeping, of surrendering consciousness and trusting in tomorrow, that is the same. That connects us across the centuries. But there is one more layer to explore before we leave this family to their rest. One more perspective that we have not yet fully considered. Because in this household, as in most colonial households, the women carried burdens that went far beyond what we've already discussed. The physical labour, the spiritual responsibilities, yes, but also the invisible labour, the emotional work, the constant management of 1,000 details that kept the family functioning. So before we bring this long evening to a close, let us look more carefully at what life was really like for the women of colonial America, at the skills they needed, the dangers they faced, and the paradox of being simultaneously essential and invisible. Let us stay with the women for a while, because if we are truly going to understand what an evening in a colonial home was like, we need to recognize that the experience was fundamentally different depending on whether you were male or female. We have talked about the family as a unit, about shared meals and shared prayers and shared labour. But within that unit, women occupied a space that was both central and marginal, both powerful and powerless. They were the backbone of the household economy, and yet they had almost no legal recognition of their contributions. Start with the sheer number of skills that a colonial woman had to master just to keep her family alive. We have mentioned some of these already, but let me lay them all out for you because the full scope is staggering. She needed to know how to cook, obviously, but colonial cooking was nothing like opening a package and following instructions on the back. She needed to know which wild plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to preserve food for winter storage, how to make cheese and butter, how to brew beer and make cider, how to bake bread without an oven, or with only a primitive brick oven that required precise management of temperature. She needed to know textile production from start to finish. That means shearing sheep, washing wool, carding it, spinning it into thread, dyeing it with plant-based dyes, weaving it into cloth cutting and sewing that cloth into garments. Every single step. And this was not occasional work. This was constant year-round labour that consumed hundreds of hours. A woman might spend 20 hours producing enough thread for a single shirt, then more hours weaving or sewing, all while also managing everything else. She needed medical knowledge. There were no doctors making house calls for ordinary illnesses. There were no pharmacies where you could pick up antibiotics or pain relievers. Women served as the primary healthcare providers for their families. They needed to know which herbs treated which ailments, how to make poultices and tinctures and salves, how to set a broken bone, how to treat burns, which, as we discussed, were horrifyingly common, how to recognize symptoms of serious illness and know when to call for outside help, which might mean sending for another woman with more experience, or in rare cases for a doctor or surgeon. And childbirth. The responsibility for managing childbirth fell entirely to women. A pregnant woman would typically be attended by a midwife, another woman with specialized knowledge and experience, and by female friends and relatives. This was called social childbirth, and it was exclusively a female domain. Men, including husbands, were generally excluded. The women would gather, provide support and assistance, and help deliver the baby. Martha Ballard, the midwife whose diary I mentioned earlier, attended over 1,000 births during her career in late 18th century Maine. Her diary records not just the births themselves, but the complex social networks that supported them. The dangers involved the triumphs and the tragedies. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. Between infection, hemorrhage, and various complications, the risks were enormous. Every pregnancy was potentially life-threatening, and if a woman survived childbirth, which most did, though the statistics are sobering, she faced years of nursing and child-rearing while simultaneously managing all her other responsibilities. There was no maternity leave, no reduction in workload because you had a newborn. The cooking still needed to be done. The spinning still needed to be done. The garden still needed tending. Life continued, and you continued with it, infant in arms or strapped to your back. Women also managed the household economy in ways that went far beyond what we might expect. They decided what to preserve and how. They managed the storage of food, rotating stock, keeping track of what was running low. They often kept chickens and managed the egg production, which was a valuable source of both food and income. Eggs could be traded or sold. They might manage a kitchen garden growing vegetables and herbs that supplemented the field crops that men grew. And here is something interesting. Women often had their own economic activities, small businesses essentially, that brought in additional income for the family. They might take in sewing or laundry from wealthier neighbours. They might sell butter or cheese that they made. They might serve as wet nurses for other families. They might take in boarders. These activities were essential to the family economy, often making the difference between comfort and hardship. Yet legally women had almost no rights. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, which governed English common law and was transplanted to the colonies, a married woman had no separate legal identity from her husband. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. Any money she earned legally belonged to her husband. If she inherited property, it became her husband's property upon marriage. This created a bizarre paradox. A woman could work from dawn to dusk, could produce goods and income, could manage complex household operations requiring skill and judgment, and yet in the eyes of the law she was essentially invisible. Her husband had legal control over everything, even though in practical terms the household could not function without her labour and expertise. There were exceptions, small gaps in the system. Widows could own property and run businesses. In fact, some of the most successful business owners in colonial America were widows who took over their dead husband's operations and ran them competently, sometimes more competently than the husbands had. There are records of women running taverns, print shops, even small manufacturing operations, but these were women whose husbands had died. Married women had no such independence, and the physical toll of women's work was immense. We talked about the dangers of cooking over an open fire, but that was just one hazard among many. Heavy lifting was constant. Water had to be carried from wells or streams. Laundry involved hauling wet, heavy cloth. Children needed to be carried. The work was repetitive, leading to chronic joint pain and back problems. Women's bodies wore out from constant use. Pregnancy compounded these physical challenges. A woman might be pregnant or nursing for 20 years or more of her adult life. Large families were common partly because children were needed for labour, partly because infant and child mortality was high, so you needed to have many children to ensure that some survived to adulthood, and partly because there was limited ability to control fertility. Some herbal methods of contraception were known, but they were unreliable and often considered sinful. Do you know what strikes me as particularly poignant? In probate records and estate inventories from this period, when a household's possessions are listed after someone dies, the items are valued and recorded in careful detail. A pewter plate might be worth this much, a chair worth that much. But nowhere in these inventories will you find the value of the knowledge in a woman's head. The medical knowledge, the textile skills, the cooking expertise, the management ability, all of that dies with her or is passed informally to daughters, but it is never valued in economic terms, never recognized as the asset it truly is. The relationship between husbands and wives in this period is complex and hard to generalize about. Some marriages were partnerships built on mutual respect and affection. We have letters between spouses that are warm loving, that show genuine partnership. John and Abigail Adams, though, from a later period, are a famous example of a couple who treated each other as intellectual equals, who discussed politics and philosophy, who genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company. But other marriages were characterized by male dominance by husbands, who expected obedience and deference, and who might enforce it with violence if they felt it necessary. Domestic violence was not illegal in the way we understand it today. A husband had a legal right to chastise his wife, though there were limits. He was not supposed to cause serious injury, but short of that, the enforcement of his authority through physical discipline was considered acceptable, even appropriate in some circumstances. Women had very limited options if they were unhappy in a marriage. Divorce was extremely rare, extremely difficult to obtain, and carried significant social stigma. Separation was sometimes possible, but it left a woman in legal limbo, still married but not living with her husband, often without adequate financial support. Most women simply endured. They made the best of their situations. They found satisfaction in their children, in their work, in their friendships with other women, and those friendships, those bonds between women were crucial. Women helped each other through the hardest moments of life. They attended each other's births. They cared for each other's children. They shared knowledge and resources. They provided emotional support in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. The community of women was in many ways a survival strategy, a way of coping with the isolation and difficulty of colonial life. There is a kind of strength in all of this that I find both inspiring and heartbreaking. These women had so little power in formal terms, and yet they kept entire households functioning. They possessed vast knowledge and skill. They worked with determination and creativity, finding ways to make do with limited resources, to solve problems, to adapt to changing circumstances. They were resilient because they had to be. Failure meant hunger, cold illness, death for their families. But I also feel a deep sadness for the opportunities denied to them. What might these women have accomplished if they'd been allowed to own property, to conduct business in their own names, to receive formal education, to participate in public life? How many potential scientists, writers, leaders, inventors were lost because half the population was confined to domestic labor and denied legal recognition? The evening we have been exploring, this typical evening in a colonial home, was shaped by women's labor at every single point. The meal that was served, the clothes everyone wore, the clean house, the functioning household, all of it rested on women's work. And yet when the father led the family in prayer, when decisions were made about the family's future, when property was transferred or businesses were established, women's voices were secondary at best, absent at worst. As we stand here in this quiet house as the family sleeps, I think about the woman lying in that bed, perhaps with an infant nestled against her, perhaps already thinking about the work that awaits her at dawn. She has worked all day. She will work all day again when the sun rises. This cycle never ends, and in between the labour she finds moments of joy, moments of connection, moments that make the hardship bearable. A child's smile, a task completed well, a conversation with a friend. The satisfaction of knowing that her family is fed and clothed and warm because of her efforts. These moments are enough, or they have to be enough because there are no alternatives. She cannot change the system she lives within. She can only navigate it as best she can using whatever small powers and freedom she possesses, building a life within the constraints that history has placed on her. And her children lying there in their shared bed, they are learning by observation what it means to be a man or a woman in this society. The boys are learning that they will have authority, responsibility, public voice. The girls are learning that they will have essential work but limited recognition, constant labour but constrained freedom. These lessons are not taught explicitly. They are absorbed through daily observation, through the structure of family life, through the way power and labour are distributed. What will become of these children? What futures await them? These are questions we cannot answer, standing here in this single evening, but we can recognise that their childhood, their formation as human beings is happening right here, in this crowded, cold, firelit room. They are learning how to be adults by watching their parents. They are learning values, skills, beliefs, fears. They are being shaped by this environment, this culture, this moment in history. And as the night deepens, as sleep claims everyone in the household, as the fire burns down to coals and the darkness presses close against the windows, we arrive at a moment of stillness, of completion. The evening is over. The tasks are done or at least paused until morning. The family is together safe for now, preparing to face another day when the sun rises. There is something both comforting and melancholy about this moment, this pause before the cycle begins again. Look at the children now sleeping in their shared bed or on their pallet near the fire. Their faces are peaceful in sleep, softened by the dim glow of the dying embers. But if we could see into their dreams, if we could understand their inner lives, what would we find? What was it actually like to be a child in this world, to grow up in this environment of constant work and strict discipline and ever-present danger? Childhood in the colonial 17th century was a fundamentally different experience than childhood today. Not just in the details, though, the details matter, but in its very conception. The idea that childhood is a special time, a protected time, a time for play and learning and gradual development, that idea barely existed. Children were seen as small adults, as workers in training, as souls in need of salvation, but also as willful creatures whose natural tendencies towards sin needed to be controlled and corrected. From the moment a child could walk steadily and follow simple instructions, which was around age 5 or 6 they were expected to work. Real work, not pretend work. A 5-year-old boy might be sent to the fields to scare birds away from the crops. A 6-year-old girl might be carding wool or watching younger siblings or helping with food preparation. These were not occasional chores. This was daily labour, often lasting many hours, that made genuine contributions to the household economy. And the work increased as the child grew. By age 8 or 10, children were doing adult-level tasks, often under minimal supervision. A 10-year-old boy might be splitting wood, caring for livestock, helping with planting and harvesting. A 10-year-old girl might be cooking meals, spinning thread, sewing clothes, managing younger children. The physical demands were substantial. These children were building muscle-developing calluses, learning endurance. But here is what is interesting. While the work was hard and constant, it was also meaningful. Children could see the direct results of their labour. The wood they split kept the family warm. The food they prepared fed their siblings. The thread they spun became the shirt on their back. There was a clear connection between effort and outcome, between work and survival. And I think that must have provided a kind of satisfaction, a sense of purpose that many modern children lack. Modern childhood, for those privileged enough to have a protected childhood, is often characterized by a disconnect between action and consequence. You go to school, but the purpose of that education is abstract years in the future. You do chores, but they are often make-work things that do not really matter. Colonial children knew that their work mattered. They could see it. They could feel it. And that knowledge, that sense of being needed and valuable that is not nothing. Of course, this came at a cost. There was very little time for play, for imagination, for the kind of unstructured exploration that child development experts now tell us is crucial for healthy growth. Play existed, certainly. We talked about the games children played in the evening, but it was limited, constrained, always subordinate to work and learning. And the learning itself was focused, practical, gendered. Boys learned by watching their fathers and other men. They learned to farm, to hunt, to use tools to build and repair things. If they were apprenticed to a craftsman, which many boys were by their early teens, they learned a specific trade through hands-on practice and observation. Reading and writing were valued especially in New England, where Puritan emphasis on scripture literacy meant that basic education was relatively widespread. But formal schooling was limited often, just a few years of learning to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. Girls learned from their mothers and other women. The vast array of skills we discussed in the previous section, all of that was transmitted through observation and practice. A girl would watch her mother spin, then try it herself, under supervision, making mistakes, improving gradually over years of practice. She would help with cooking, first doing simple tasks, then more complex ones as her skills developed. She would learn about herbs and medicine, about childcare, about managing a household. And both boys and girls learned the catechism, learned scripture, learned to fear God and respect authority. This moral and religious education was considered at least as important as practical skills. A child who could work hard but lacked proper religious instruction was seen as a failure. The goal was to produce not just competent workers, but godly adults who would contribute to the community and crucially achieve salvation. The relationship between parents and children in this period is hard for us to fully understand because it was so different from modern parenting. There was love, certainly, but it was expressed within a framework of strict discipline and emotional restraint. Excessive affection was considered dangerous, likely to spoil the child and make them weak or disobedient. The saying we mentioned earlier, loved but not pampered, tenderness but not softness, captures this perfectly. Physical discipline was common and considered necessary. A child who disobeyed might be whipped not brutally but firmly enough to make an impression. This was not seen as abuse. It was seen as good parenting, as doing what was necessary to teach obedience and respect. The Bible itself commanded parents to discipline their children, and colonists took this directive seriously. Yet alongside this strictness, there were moments of genuine care and affection. A father carving a toy for his son, a mother singing softly to a sick child, the small gifts and kindnesses that we know about from diaries and letters. These people loved their children. They just expressed that love differently than we do within the constraints of their beliefs about child rearing and their understanding of what children needed to become successful adults. And here is something crucial to understand. The high rate of child mortality affected everything about how parents related to their children. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all children died before age 16. Some died in infancy, some from childhood diseases, some from accidents. This was so common that every family experienced it. Every parent knew that any child might not survive to adulthood. How do you parent when you know the odds are that you will lose at least one, possibly several of your children? Some historians argue that parents emotionally distanced themselves, that they did not allow themselves to get too attached, because the pain of loss was so overwhelming. But the historical record does not really support this. Diaries and letters from the period show genuine grief when children died. Parents mourned deeply. They were not indifferent. I think what happened instead was that they learned to live with uncertainty, with the constant awareness that death was close, that any fever or cough might turn deadly. They did not avoid loving their children. They just loved them, knowing that loss was almost inevitable. And maybe that made them treasure the time they had even more. Maybe it made every small moment more precious because they understood how fragile it all was. The children themselves were aware of death in ways that modern children in developed countries typically are not. They attended funerals. They saw siblings die. They understood that life was not guaranteed. In Puritan communities especially, children were taught explicitly about death and judgment. They were told that they could die at any moment, and if they died without being saved, they would go to hell. This sounds horrifying to us, and it was frightening. But it was also meant to motivate children to live righteously, to take their spiritual lives seriously. And some children did die young with remarkable composure, at least according to the accounts we have. There are stories of children on their deathbeds reciting scripture, praying, comforting their grieving parents, displaying a faith and acceptance that was held up as exemplary. We should be skeptical of these accounts. To some degree, they were often written to make a moral point, to provide an example for others. But even allowing for embellishment, it seems clear that children in this period had a relationship with death that was more direct, more familiar than ours. Toys existed, though they were simple and often homemade. A wooden doll, perhaps, with a cloth dress sewn by the child's mother. A whirligig, that spinning disc on a string that we mentioned earlier. Bulls made from scraps of cloth. Small animals carved from wood. These were precious items treasured because they were rare, and they served a dual purpose. They provided entertainment, yes, but they also taught skills. A girl playing with a doll was learning childcare. A boy playing with a carved horse was learning about the animals he would work with as an adult. What did children think about their lives? Did they resent the work, the discipline, the lack of freedom? We have very few first-person accounts from children themselves. Most of the records we have were written by adults looking back on their childhoods, and those memories are filtered through years of experience and cultural expectations. But the few child diaries that survive, like that of Anna Green Winslow, that we have referenced, show children who seem to accept their lives as normal. They complain occasionally about specific tasks or punishments, but they do not question the overall structure. This was simply how life was, and there were compensations. The close bonds with siblings sleeping together every night, working together every day. The sense of being part of a family unit, a community, something larger than yourself. The clear path forward, knowing what was expected, what your future would look like. There is comfort in that kind of certainty, even if it comes with restrictions. Modern children often struggle with too many choices, too much uncertainty about the future. Colonial children had the opposite problem. Their futures were largely predetermined by their gender and their family's social position. A farmer's son would be a farmer. A craftsman's son might be apprenticed to learn a trade. A merchant's daughter might marry another merchant. The possibilities were limited. But that limitation also meant clarity, a kind of security in knowing where you fit and what was expected of you. As these children sleep, they're growing, developing, absorbing the lessons that will shape them into adults. Some will survive to adulthood, marry, have children of their own, repeat the cycle. Others will die young, their potential unfulfilled, their stories ending before they really begin. None of them knows which fate awaits them. They simply live day by day, doing what is required, finding joy where they can, enduring hardship when they must. And in this they are perhaps not so different from children in any era. The specifics change, the material conditions improve or worsen, the beliefs and values shift, but the fundamental experience of growing up, of learning who you are and where you fit in the world, that is universal. These colonial children sleeping by the firelight in their scratchy wool blankets, they are fully human, fully real, as complex and individual as any child today. Their dreams, whatever they are dreaming right now, are their own, private, unknowable to us. And maybe that is fitting, because for all that we can reconstruct about their material lives, about the houses they lived in, and the food they ate, and the work they did there, are aspects of their inner experience that remain forever hidden. We can make educated guesses, we can infer from the records that survive, but we cannot truly know what it felt like to be them, to live in their skins, to see the world through their eyes. And as we prepare to step back from this intimate glimpse into their lives, as we get ready to leave this family to their sleep and their dreams, it is worth taking a moment to reflect on everything we have seen this evening, on all the layers of life, all the complexity and contradiction, all the hardship and grace that characterized existence in a colonial home. Because this evening, this single evening, contains within it the seeds of so much that would come later. We've spent this evening inside a colonial home, watching the hours unfold from dusk to sleep. We've seen the fire burning, the candles flickering, the family gathering for meals and prayers and work. We've looked closely at the details, the material realities, the daily rhythms that structured life in the 1600s. But before we leave this family to their rest, before we step back across the centuries to our own time, I want us to think about what all of this means. What can we learn from this evening? What connects us to these people across such a vast gulf of time and circumstance? The first thing that strikes me after spending all this time in their company is the sheer resilience. These people were tough in ways that most of us cannot imagine. They worked harder than we work. They endured discomforts that would seem unbearable to us, cold that penetrated to the bone, hunger that was not just missing a meal, but genuine nutritional deprivation, pain without relief, illness without effective treatment, loss without closure, and they kept going, day after day, season after season, year after year. They got up at dawn and worked until dark and then did it all again. What gave them the strength to do this? Partly it was simply necessity. There was no alternative. You worked or you starved, you endured or you died. The margin between survival and catastrophe was thin, and everyone knew it. But I think it was more than just fear of death that motivated them. It was also hope. Hope for a better future, if not for themselves, then for their children. Hope that their sacrifices would create something lasting, something worthwhile. And they were right in a way. The colonies they built through tremendous labour and suffering became the foundation for something larger. The United States, with all its contradictions and complexities, grew out of these small settlements, these struggling families, these evening gatherings by the fire. The values they held, for better and worse, shaped the culture that followed. The work ethic, the emphasis on individual responsibility, the religious foundations, the structures of family and community, all of it traces back to these early colonial experiences. But we should be careful not to romanticize. Yes, there was resilience and hope and community, but there was also tremendous inequality, exploitation, and violence. The land these colonists built on was taken from Native American peoples through warfare, disease, and broken treaties. The prosperity of many colonial families, especially in the South, was built on the labor of enslaved Africans who had no hope of freedom, who suffered under conditions that were even more brutal than those faced by poor colonists. When we look at this evening in this colonial home, we're looking at a specific family, a specific experience. But there were many other evenings happening simultaneously that looked very different. In enslaved quarters on southern plantations, people were living under conditions of bondage, their labor stolen, their families subject to being torn apart at the whim of their enslavers. In Native American villages, community were dealing with the catastrophic impact of European diseases and the encroachment of colonial settlement. These stories are part of the same historical moment, the same colonial period, and they must be acknowledged even as we focus on this particular household. The contradictions are profound. The same colonists who valued hard work and community also participated in or benefited from systems of exploitation. The same religious beliefs that provided comfort and meaning also justified harsh treatment of children, subordination of women, and in many cases violence against those deemed other. History is not simple. People are not simple. We contain multitudes, and so did they. But let us return to this specific family sleeping in their cold house by the dying fire. What would they think if they could see us now, if they could see the world we have built on the foundations they laid? I think they would be astonished by the material abundance, the technology, the comfort. The idea that we have instant light at the flip of a switch, that we can control the temperature of our homes, that we have enough food, that we worry about eating too much rather than too little. All of this would seem miraculous to them. They would probably be troubled by some aspects of our culture, the breakdown of traditional family structures, the questioning of religious authority, the independence of women and children. These would challenge their fundamental beliefs about how society should be organized, but they might also recognize some continuities. We still work, though our work looks different. We still care for our families. We still seek meaning and purpose. We still struggle with the big questions of existence, even if we frame them in different terms. And what do we take from this evening we've spent with them? What lessons are worth carrying forward? I think there are several. First, the value of meaningful work. These colonists had hard lives, but their work had clear purpose and visible results. In our modern world, where so much labor is abstract and disconnected from outcomes, there is something to be learned from that direct connection between effort and result. Second, the importance of community and interdependence. Colonial families could not survive alone. They needed each other, needed the support of neighbors and extended family and community networks. We have gained tremendous individual freedom in modern life, but we have also become more isolated. The colonial reminder that we are fundamentally social creatures, that we need each other, that is worth remembering. Third, an appreciation for what we have. It is easy to take for granted the conveniences of modern life until you really understand how hard things used to be. Light at night was precious and hard won. Warmth in winter was a constant struggle. Clean clothes required hours of labor. Food security was never guaranteed. We live with an abundance that would have seemed impossible to colonial families, and recognizing that abundance, being grateful for it, can help us maintain perspective. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, resilience in the face of hardship. We all face difficulties in our lives. Loss, disappointment, struggle, pain. These are universal human experiences. The colonists faced these things with a combination of practical problem-solving, community support, and faith in something larger than themselves. We may not share their specific beliefs, but the underlying approach, finding ways to endure, and even find meaning in hardship that remains relevant. As I think about this family one last time before we leave them, I find myself hoping that their night was peaceful, that the fire stayed contained, that no one fell ill, that they woke up the next morning to face another day with whatever strength and grace they could muster. Most likely they did. Most days were ordinary, neither triumphant nor tragic, just another turn of the wheel, another chapter in the ongoing story of survival. And their descendants, if they had descendants who survived, might have gone on to do remarkable things, or ordinary things, or both. They might have stayed in that same community for generations, or they might have moved west with the expanding frontier, or they might have returned to England, or they might have died young and left no trace. We do not know their specific story because we have been visiting a composite, an amalgamation of many families drawn from historical records and scholarship. But somewhere in your own family tree, if you have ancestry that traces back to colonial America, there are people who lived evenings like this, who gathered by fires, who worked by candlelight, who prayed together, who struggled and endured and occasionally found joy in small things. And if your ancestry is from elsewhere, from other continents and other traditions, then your ancestors were having their own versions of these evenings, with different details but similar themes: work, family, survival, hope. We're all the inheritors of thousands of years of human struggle and adaptation. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying human experiences, the need for shelter and food and connection and meaning, these are constants. And in understanding how people in the past met these needs, how they created lives within the constraints of their time and place, we can perhaps understand ourselves a little better. The night is fully settled now in this colonial home. Outside, the November darkness is complete. Inside, the last embers glow faintly. Everyone is sleeping, or mostly sleeping. Perhaps someone stirs, adds a log to the fire, settles back into sleep. The house creaks and shifts, settling into the cold. Somewhere a mouse scurries. The wind picks up slightly, whistling through small gaps in the walls. And in this moment, this quiet moment of rest between one day and the next, there is a kind of peace. Not the absence of hardship that will return with the dawn, but a temporary respite, a gathering of strength, a pause in the endless cycle of labour. The family is together, they are warm enough, they are fed enough, they have each other. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new work, new struggles. But right now, in this moment, they are all right. We're going to leave them here in this moment of peace. We have intruded on their evening long enough, watched them through their private hours, learned what we can from their experiences. It is time for us to step back, to return to our own time, carrying with us the images and insights from this journey into the past. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for your patience with the slow pace, the careful attention to detail, the willingness to sit with discomfort and complexity. History is not always easy or comfortable, but it is always illuminating. In understanding where we came from, we gain perspective on where we are, and perhaps some wisdom about where we might be going. This has been a long evening, both for the colonial family and for us watching them, but I hope it has been worthwhile. I hope you have learned something, felt, something thought about, something in a new way. That is all we can ask from history, really. Not easy answers or simple lessons, but deeper understanding, broader perspective, and maybe a little more compassion for the human struggle across time. The fire will be rebuilt in the morning. The family will wake and begin the cycle again. Work and prayer and meals and sleep over and over until one day they do not wake up until their part in the story ends and others take their place. That is the human condition. We do our best with what we have for as long as we have it, and then we pass the torch to the next generation. If you have enjoyed spending this evening in a colonial home with me, there are many more stories waiting to be told, Many more moments in history worth exploring. Each one offers its own lessons, its own insights into the human experience. I will be back soon with another journey into the past, another opportunity to see the world through different eyes, another chance to learn from those who came before us. Until then, take care of yourselves, be kind to one another, and maybe when you flip on a light switch or adjust your thermostat or grab food from your refrigerator, take just a moment to appreciate how far we have come from those cold November evenings by the fire. Not to feel superior, but to feel grateful. And maybe also to feel a sense of responsibility to use our abundance wisely, to honour the struggles of our ancestors by building something worthy of their sacrifices. Good night, sleep well, and I will see you again soon.